Hello, my name is David Adès. I'm a poet based in Sydney and the host of this monthly poetry podcast reading series called Poets Corner, in association with WestWords in Parramatta in Sydney's West. WestWords is Western Sydney's literature development organisation. Poets Corner is part of WestWords' public programming that celebrates the richness, diversity and insight that literature offers. Especially in these times, we thank the ongoing support of Create New South Wales, the Cultural Fund of Copyright Australia, City of Parramatta Council, Blacktown City Council, and Campbelltown City Council, as well as the many project partners that have enabled us to continue to provide opportunities to writers and audiences. We hope that this new, ever-changing, difficult world will see a sharing and a closeness of spirit. As you would all know, each month I invite a poet to read poems and talk about them around a theme of the poet's choice. Our guest poet today is Mark Tredinnick, who will be reading poems and talking with me on the intriguing theme, I think it's intriguing, of the 6 gifts. But first, an acknowledgement of country. I'm recording this from Beecroft in Sydney. Mark is recording from Bowral, southwest of Sydney. I'd like to pay my respects to and acknowledge the elders, past, present and emerging of the Wallamita people, the traditional custodians of the land in Beecroft, and of the Gundungurra people, the traditional owners of the land from which Mark is recording, and to acknowledge also that they are the sovereign owners of their land, which has never been ceded or given up. Dr. Mark Tredinnick is a celebrated Australian poet. His honours include 2 Premier's Prizes and the Montreal, Cardiff, Newcastle, Blake, Ron Pretty and ACU Poetry Prizes. I like saying that. His writing and teaching over 25 years have touched the work and lives of many. In 2020, Mark received an OAM for services to literature and education. And in 2023, he was awarded the Golden Tibetan Antelope International Poetry Award, China's top prize for foreign poets. Mark's most recent books are A Beginner's Guide, Birdfish 2022, and 9 Carols, Five Islands Press 2023. His many books include Fire Diary, A Gathered Distance, The Blue Plateau, The Little Red Riding Book, and Walking Underwater. Houses of Thieves, 100 Poems in Chinese, was published by Guangxi Normal University Press in June 2023. Mark is the father of 5, and he lives with his partner Jodie in Gundungurra Country, southwest of Sydney. He is now the managing editor of the revived Five Islands Press. Hi, Mark, and welcome to Poets Corner.
Hi, David. You need a break after all that. Well done, you.
Yeah. And congratulations on your recent wedding. You're the first just married poet to appear on Poets Corner.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Yes, it feels nice. Also, I think we go back a way, don't we, with this particular?
Well, I was going to say, it's really a welcome back, because way back in February 2018, you were the very first poet to read at the live predecessor of this podcast series. So I'm delighted to do a podcast with you at last. And in fact, you introduced me to Michael Campbell and WestWords, and we've, traveled a long way, Michael Campbell, WestWords and I, since then. So thank you for that as well.
Well, that's wonderful, David. Yeah, lovely to be here.
I'm intrigued by your theme, the six gifts. And I know we're going to talk about them as we go through the poems, but for viewers who haven't had the benefit of reading your wonderful essay on the subject, can you give us an introduction to what you're referring to when you say the 6 gifts?
All right. I mean, a little context, David, probably helps here, and it's a China connection. I found myself, as I have found myself a number of times now, back in 2019, I think, in China at a poetry festival. My work had been discovered over there largely thanks to the beautiful translations that Isabel Lee made of some of my work early on in a publication that Kit Kellen made. So my work had been found. I found myself there, and as is my experience in China, they tell you relatively little and expect a lot. So I got no one had told us what we'd really be doing there, but it became apparent from the misfortune of one of my fellow poets that we had to get something said about our connection to poetry and why we felt it mattered to us and to the world. And we had to get it said in about 6 minutes. No one got it done in 6 minutes, it's got to be said, but still there was a sort of a time limit. And that included the translation time, because everything is translated into to Chinese from, in his case, Spanish, in my case, English. So I found myself realizing I'd be on later on the next day, and I didn't want to stuff it up. So I sat there. I had Major Jackson, a wonderful American poet, right beside me. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm getting ready for tomorrow." And they all went out on some gig, and I sat and thought, what can I say from all of my thinking over the years about what poetry has meant to me and means, and from my own practice, that I can encapsulate in some way. So I thought, I don't know why 6 came to mind. The Chinese love numbers, actually, and 6 did come to mind. And I thought, I can say these 6 things. If I could say 6 things because of 6 minutes. That's what it was. That was my thinking. So I thought, what are 6 things? And this is what I came up with. So the idea here is that poetry exists in the world, has evolved in the world to deliver up to us these 6 gifts, to all humans, actually, to human consciousness broadly. And so I started big with freedom, and I finished big with justice, and they're fairly big in the middle as well. But as you'll know from having looked at it, each of them gives me a way to say something particular also about poetic form and poetic language, as well as the functions I think it serves.
Well, you'd be pleased to know that you've got more than 6 minutes today.
Yeah, that's lucky, isn't it? I've used them already, you see. I'm way over.
All right. Well, just sort of expanding on that, I mean, as you say, these gifts are a product of your thinking about poetry deeply for many years. How did each of these particular gifts arrive in your thinking?
Each of them has its own story, I suppose, David. So, for example, freedom, which is the first one, I start by quoting Robert Bringhurst saying poetry frees language from writing. A lovely, uncanny proposition. And that one ends up being some thoughts that I bring together from some deep thinking over many years about the really fundamental work that I feel poetry as a literary form, as a cultural practice, almost as a spiritual practice, I'd say, performs in the world. And I guess that thinking comes from who I am as a person. You know, my mother was a player of Bach, sacred musician. I grew up with Bach and also Charles Wesley in the house. These things are not strange to me, the idea of sacredness and music and the service of that, and also of sacred texts turned into, oratory, which is what my grandfather's work was. So I've always had a sense, I think, that my way of witnessing being and practicing being and being with others well included practicing language at its very highest level. And so freeing us from the travesties that occur in human society and in an individual life, I think, when language is done badly, like when we diminish it, when we govern and preach and teach and think of our own lives in inadequate metaphors and in crashed language or mercantile scripts, life is diminished and you get sentimental existences out of all of that. And I think you get Trumpism. I think what you're getting in the world, not just in America, is partly a result of the flight of lyricism from people's daily awareness. And so coming in, living with poetry in a sense, David, I think, which is the human tradition, because poetry is the original literature. And it sits very closely with religious practice, and in fact, in many cultures has been religious practice, not about dogmas, just about reconciling oneself with the mystery of existence and coming to terms with the dreadful realization that we're not going to live forever, but that something does. We could maybe try and be that. That's poetry's area. And because we are languaging creatures, creatures defined by living in and through language. When language is bad, it goes badly. When language is at its best and we can access it, it goes better for us. So the idea of freedom there comes from a very deep place, a lot of thinking about philosophy and spiritual intelligence, I guess partly from my own experience, partly from my studies. And my studies have included work in ecology and philosophy, and my own existence has included a lot of music and text, of a sacred kind. I know this is not common to everybody's life, but Jesus, I wish it were.
No, I look, I get that from reading the essay. I was just wondering, just as an aside, if people want to read the essay, because it's a marvelous read, where can they get hold of it?
So the essay was actually written, David, as you know now, because they asked me to write an acceptance speech of some length. I never asked Mark Tredinnick, never use the word substantial, or you'll get 10,000 words. They were fine with that. So they published it in an edition, which is probably inaccessible to most people in both Chinese and English. I've stuck it on my website. So that's the easiest place for now. But it's going to be the title essay in a collection of my prose, which will bring out at some point through the press or another press in the next little while. But in the meantime, the place to find it's on my website, which is just marktredinnick.com.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is, as you say, a product of many, many years of thinking, but is it a work in progress, Mark? Are there going to be more gifts?
Hope so. I definitely hope so. Or else what I'll realize, as one always does as a writer, is that one didn't say it quite right.
Yeah.
So, you'd never draw the line on your openness to wisdom, and everything. And I'm sure I've not got this right. Even as I go through, I teach the gift. It's a handy teaching tool, actually. And in fact, I structure my masterclass, What the Light Tells, which runs for 6 weeks. And each week I structure, thematically, I structure the thing according to one of the gifts. So it's been a handy pedagogic device. But yeah, when I teach it, I realize that, for example, there's quite a lot of overlap between reconnection, which is one of the gifts, and hearthing, which is one of the others. They say some particular things, but when I'm teaching it, sometimes I go category error because I realize that those two things have so much overlap that they're probably not actually really separate. And there are many other things one might say, but I have found these 6 a vehicle that allows me to get pretty much all the things said so that have occurred to me so far about poetry. So yeah, there'll be more gifts though.
Well, I mean, it's clear that you're passionate about poetry, what poetry can do and what poetry can give to its readers. That poetry can acknowledge and celebrate and raise consciousness about these gifts and urge us to pay attention, to be present in our lives. Is this what you are hoping to do with these poems?
It's a funny thing, isn't it? The ambition one might be said to have for a poem, that's never overt for me. I think the poem simply arises from an urge to get get something articulated. And when you look back on it, as we've done a bit, curating the poems for this collection, you can see connections to thoughts. And I guess I carry with me a hope that in practicing poetry, I'm continuing a tradition that has served those purposes. I believe in that quite strongly. We write downstream of everything that precedes us, and we write upstream of what's going to follow us. And I feel as though poetry is given to some of us to care for. And so I just hope, I guess, it's an act of faith really for me, that something that occurs to me to get written will participate in carrying on poetry's work. But beyond that, I give it zilch thought, David. I just get the words down, as and it's the struggle with the syllables and the form and all of that. And then in the end, if a poem feels right, you look back and you'll often think, yeah, I suppose that does contribute to a stream of thought, to an idea that might be helpful for somebody else. I guess this is an important idea. Maybe this comes up later, but it's on my mind now. I think an error that I see among readers and writers is to imagine that the poem articulates the life and self of the writer. I actually think that's a mistake. I think it includes that, and that's where it begins. I think that a poem that stops in that place is a solipsism. It's just a poem that goes, me, here I am, look at my pain, look at my delight. That's where it begins. But the hope, and I do have this hope, although again, in writing a poem, you just give over to craft mostly, and hope that craft helps you to achieve this outcome. But what you want is the experience I get from reading other literature, especially poetry, which is that suddenly, for example, in a poem written by a 35-year-old gay woman, I find a perfect articulation of my life's experience.
Mm.
That's what one wants. And one's enlarged by that, of course. One's taught to understand self more deeply and inclusively and empathetically. So really, the self that we're hoping to articulate, I think, is a human life, any human life to which such things might have happened or might yet. That's a sense I carry of some importance.
And if you situate, a poem in a continuum between upstream and downstream, it's a conversation with other poems, isn't it?
Always, yeah, that's right. That is the tradition, isn't it? And even the voice that one hopes to find to get things said and to do justice to them, which is an idea we'll come back to. That voice, you have to know, is informed, as I've confessed already, like anything that might be called the signature Mark Tredinnick, move in a poem will be tainted, inflected with Barry Lopez and Mujuru and Judith Nyla Crispin and ancient Chinese poets and Li Bai and so on. And that's a beautiful thing. The way that any piece of country gets to articulate itself in any given moment because of geomorphological movements 300 million years ago and more recent erosion and pollution and change over time. So we are current instantiations, in our voice and speaking of many things that have informed, that ridiculous coalescence of circumstances that conspired to give us David Adès at one point with his particular life to tell. It's a miracle and, and a mess, of course, for all of us at the same time. And you speak from there. And you speak from there with a sense, I think, of gratitude and the miraculous and humility.
I hope so. I hope that's always present. But what other role do you think poetry has in articulating these particular gifts and in making us think further about them?
Well, I suppose it's an invitation back into depth and silence and deep into language, other people's and one's own. I think poetry is an invitation always to slow and consider. Got a dog barking at the door. I might have to go and deal with that in a second. Speaking of silence. And also activism is an interesting point here, isn't it? We are in a very overtly activist moment culturally. And my own belief is that poetry is innately revolutionary, but the revolution that it wants to recruit, that's the word I want, recruit us to, is a revolution of the molecules of self. Like it's about, as you said before, I think, awakening a deeper level of consciousness and awareness and compassion and gratitude. That's what's performed between the poem and the reader. And one hopes that leads to people living better lives and living with more compassion and gratitude and forgiveness and some of these gifts actually in the world. But the kind of activist, and look, there are many poetries and they all have their function, but I think the kind of poems that date really fast and work least well in contributing to that revolution are the poems that are most overtly activist, because those poems end up getting a bit locked in the politics and sociology and ideologies of their times. And they often give people a sense of, pious contribution, but they don't work as well. I think it's compulsory in poetry to turn whatever experience it is and whatever articulation we want to make with the devices of metaphor and language into something human and something that escapes as well as doing justice to its moment. How would it be if I just let my dog in here, David?
Off you go.
It will help people to know that his name is Dante, that dog. So he needs to be part of the conversation, is what he's telling me.
Well, shall we have a poem?
Yes, David, that'd be great. So we thought that we might start with a poem called A Short Story of Flying. This poem is actually the prologue to Walking Underwater, 2021 book. I think that's Pitt Street Poetry, and they make such lovely books. It's a joy to read from them. A short story of flying proceeds in a very old form, actually, David. It's called Rhyming Couplets.
I remember that.
Yeah, rhyming couplets as old as Chaucer, and indeed older, but Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales proceeds entirely in these couplets, which are made of iambic pentameters. So da 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 da. It's called the riding rhyme because of the rhythm. And every line you get a rhyme. So in my opening couplet, it's bird and herd. Now I hardly ever rhyme, and rhyming's a bit kind of 19th century in certain kind of ways, and in some poetry circles, but it remains one of the devices of poetry. I found myself writing this poem in conversation, since you mentioned the word, with Alice Oswald, who has a poem in exactly this form called The Short Story of Falling. So a short story of flying is a kind of riposte in a way. I think I mention a rooster in this poem, and it was a rooster that seemed to think that the right time to crow was the entirety of the night, rather than at dawn, when I thought they were supposed to. So I refer to a diurnal trick in the poem, and I think that's what I've got in mind. A short story of flying after Alice Oswald. It is the story of the calling bird, a secret freely shared, but rarely heard. Its flying spooled and sky distilled and swilled, like walking, like waking, across the dawn, the lawn, the field of maize, the forest in the afternoon. It is the spinning world, its waxing moon. A tide that turns in things the way a river springs from rock, the shock of hope, the shiver that thrills inside the thought of rested wings. The way a coiled mind now calms and springs again into the flight it knew before it fouled its lines along a lawless shore. It is the lyric of the patient earth that wants the sky to be its second birth. If freedom is the hardest edge to hold, this is how it's held, unbought, unsold. This morning, it's the song two spinebills climb into the rigging of midwinter's rhyme that's undressed every garden tree and woken me to days like doors that want to open, chords that want to cry grief down. They've flown as one must let the past, before I've grown some legs and found the heart to rise and score their music on this page as if it were my own. And overnight it was the owls, like books of wanton hours, the crooning fowls that mistake every midnight for the dawn. Let their eternal error be my own diurnal trick, a moral overheard, the breaking story of the calling bird.
So you mentioned that this poem's a response to Alice Oswald's A Short Story of Falling, and takes its shape and rhyme and rhythm scheme from it. Can you say something about Oswald's poem story, and why you wanted to respond to it in this poem?
Actually, David, only a little bit. I came across, I mean, people would probably know that Alice Oswald is a remarkable poet. I'd come across some of her work on one of my trips back to the UK, and she has been, but now isn't anymore, I think the first female professor of poetry at Oxford University. Oxford has discovered women, it turns out. I think she's a remarkable poet. I heard Andrew Motion, who was a poet laureate of the UK and the judge of the Montreal Prize, I'm very pleased to say, when I won it, because it connected me to him. But I heard him say in a podcast on The New Yorker, I think, how much he admires Alice Oswald above many other people, I think, in contemporary poetry, for the humanity and humility and mastery of her craft, and the way that it's always turned toward the perils of the earth and of all of us on it, the kind of justice that she's hoping to get done there. But to be honest with you, I found this poem not in the book, but online. I think I found it in a poetry, either on the Poetry Foundation or in poem a day from the American Academy. And it came down and found me. And that's the thing I'd like to say, really. That's a wonderful moment in a life, and in a poet's life, it's also a gift just to read a poem and to know that there's something being called forth from you in response. Her poem is about rain, mine's about birds. So she has, and hers is about melancholy and sadness and rising above, and actually so is mine. It finds the poet in the midst of dark days and struggling to find hope, I suppose. But I chose to use the bird's flight as the metaphor for that. And she uses rain in its beauty. She celebrates, I guess, the necessity and the beauty of downness. And I would celebrate, like, insistently. I just needed to write a poem that insisted that one could rise. And so I wrote it. It's remarkable when you reread your work, isn't it? Because I can almost not hear my grief anymore in the poem. At least I can hear it, but I hear much more of a kind of courage and joyfulness, actually, that belongs to my present moment. It's really funny with poetry. I often find that I write about 5 years ahead of where I'm at in my emotional life, particularly. And poetry helps one, and this is one of the other gifts, but it does help me, I would say, often find a way to rise up out of the circumstances that afflict one or one's gloom or whatever. Even when I'm not thinking I'm succeeding, sometimes that happens because language itself is very wise and very old, and form is very old and very wise, and form belongs to the community, not to the ego. This is why form matters so much, because when we recruit form, we're recruiting the whole history of poetry across many, many cultures, not just patriarchal recent ones, but all cultures. Poetry belongs to communities, and form is how they've received poetry in cultures in time. So I think it's, as Jim Galvin, the poet, once said to me, I'm not smart enough to have written any of my poems, Mark, but language is, and I plug into language through form. And I think it's not, and when he says language, I understand that to mean you plug into wisdom, and wisdom greater than my ego can ever acquire through language, and asking language to perform the musical tricks that it does, the kind of tricks of nature in a way. So the form was actually more important, I'd say, in this poem's response than the biographical details of why that poem arose for Alice Oswald when it did. The fact that it was what has seemed to me to be a lovely example of a contemporary articulation of a very old form that bore next to no traces of antiquity in it, except for lovely ones. So one thing I'm doing in that poem, I notice whenever I read it, is I rhyme, but you'll notice how even more often I internally rhyme. There's lots and lots of playing with the form, a kind of pushing back against it, a kind of 21st insistence that one mustn't conform to mere and meager obvious rhymes anymore. And there's a lot of playfulness actually in that. It's probably how I found the hope, I think.
No, I enjoyed the internal rhymes and the end line rhymes. And I was wondering, I mean, it almost feels to me more like a song of flying rather than a short story of flying. And maybe I'm tapping into the bird song, but can you say something about the rhyme and rhythm scheme and what it brings to the poem, to the subject matter, and how difficult it was to write with both internal and end line rhymes?
Really easy, as it turns out. I think the internal rhymes simply happened, I've got to say. And I think it happened because of finding my way into what I think of as the poetry place. And it's a place where one isn't in one's ego or just one's social self or gendered self or any form of identity. One is in a realm of consciousness that's deeply human. And in that place, poetry plays. And you can find it if you teach yourself, like there is a bit of learning. We all know what iambic pentameter is, actually, because it runs through
Three rhymes and, you know.
yeah, well, the whole, it's right at the center, like it's the signature scheme, of course, of English language poetry for centuries. And that's no accident, because it conforms very closely to what English sounds like when we speak it well. Da 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 da, goes like that. So soon might have a book you'd like to read. It's just natural, really natural, but poets notice it and play it up. And so the sonnet, for example, and the villanelle forms that not only in English actually use that form. So, but I do notice, I think Australia's is a culture of rather tone deafness with poetry, it's got to be said. Our great poets, even Judith Wright and Les Murray, are not especially rhythmical poets. There's an aspect of Australian, whatever that means these days, but you know, the dominant culture of the colonizing culture was a bit tone deaf, it's got to be said. And we've written great work across time, but not especially, not since Lawson and the 19th century. I guess partly a reaction against those kind of heroic couplets, oddly enough, is one of the names for the form that I've used, but a reaction partly of the 20th century against that heroic sort of poetry was, I think, an overt tone deafness, a kind of pushing back against the perceived risks of those forms. But using form takes you deep into language, David, deep into the lyric reservoirs of language. And I find that then there are gifts that comes, as partly what I mean by freedom, I suppose, giving yourself to better disciplines, so poetic disciplines, better than ideological ones, better than any other merely prose disciplines, returns the gift sometimes that you get access to, you know, to things like that, like the gifts of those rhymes, and they come kind of naturally because of craft and reading over a long time, and they're the gift of the moment. The end rhymes also, as you notice, are very often half rhymes, and at least half the time they're open. So in a traditional heroic couplet, each couplet is supposed to be what's called closed. And there are only about 3 in the whole poem, where I actually have a full stop at the end of the couplet. So I'm also subverting the form there a little bit by constantly enjamming through the rhyming word, so you barely notice it. And that seems delightful to me. Like, I like it in poetry. I just read a poem by Gavin Gow, which I didn't realize until I was reading his note on it, was an ABCdarian, where he goes, I didn't even notice. I love that. Like, it's so, what that means is the form doesn't master the poem escapes, transcends the form. And I think this poem, as the birds transcend dailiness and the limb and fly, and as I hope one's life can fly, I guess the use of those enjambments and the transfiguration of the norms is a way in which I hope that the poem practices and models and encourages transcendence.
Well, I mean, from my perspective, it's a delight to read out loud, which I did a number of times, and it's because of the musicality, and the musicality doesn't interfere with what the poem's saying. In fact, it probably enhances it. So I'm sure that other people enjoyed it as much as I did, and you obviously do. I was interested in your use of flight as a metaphor for freedom, because there's freedom in the idea of flight, unrestrained by gravity, but flight also connotes escape. And I was wondering if both of these ideas are present in the poem.
I never thought about that, actually, very much. I'd have to say that my conscious thoughts, as you can tell, because I hit that note a few times, are about freedom. So there's that line in there that goes, if freedom is a hard edge to hold, this is how it's held, unboard, unsold. I'd actually had that idea about 15 years ago, the first line, freedom is a hard edge to hold. Never found, I tried it in a couple of other poems over the years, and always felt as though I was forcing it, like, jemmying it in there. This is the thing that happens, isn't it? And so never forget your lines, though. Write them down somewhere, don't forget. And I found that one just came to me when I was writing it. So yes, I guess and there's an idea around that part of the poem, which came from a conversation I had with the poet, William Stafford. William Stafford's son, Kim, I should say. I'll find my poem now, but that's the one about freely shared but rarely heard. That one. It's a thing his father had said to him about wisdom, in life. You know, wisdom is actually accessible to us all the time, but we mostly simply choose not to hear it. So I'm thinking ideas about freedom from platitude and freedom from evil and negativity and cliche and so on. For me, there's a continuum, I think, to the other flight. There's kind of fleeing from, but it's going to be about being a refugee and finding flight away from imprisonment too. It's just that the emphasis falls maybe more at some moments in anyone's lived experience on the desperation of getting away, or the arrival into. But actually, I suppose in the end, the poem is trying to argue for the coexistence. You know, a bird is wonderful because it lands, and a bird is wonderful because it takes off. Again, it has to nest as well as fly. But I find I love the birds. I love the birds because I think we ignore nature at our peril, but I also just love them because they're super cool. Like, wouldn't you like to be able to do all that stuff? Like, you know, feathers. Flight is one of the things that I think in human consciousness, we just go, wow, that must be so cool to live in that other dimension and to be at ease in one's body in another kind of realm. It's a bit godlike. But you're right. I think that the emphasis in the poem is much more on the achievement of transcendence in some other realm than a desperation. It's not dwelling upon the difficulties of one's circumstances. But you can tell in the poem when I say before I'd had the wit to grow some legs and walk downstairs, it's a poem about depression. It is a poem about like finding a way sometimes in life simply just to carry on. And all of us at a certain point will find ourselves afflicted. Some people are afflicted for long periods by that. And I hope the poem articulates understanding and compassion for desperate circumstances too. But then again, I hope that's true of every poem.
I wanted to ask you about the lines. The way a coiled mind now calms and springs again into the flight it knew before it fouled its lines along a lawless shore. Is that a commentary on how we can self-impose strictures on freedom? How our minds can be their own cage and we then have to try and break free from them?
Yeah, that's well put, David. And again, I think that where the poem rose was from an experience in my own life of feeling like the victim of interpretations of one's life and behavior that had been put upon it by other people. I'll just be oblique about that. But, you know, people find themselves in those circumstances from time to time, and I did, and that felt like a tyranny and an imprisonment. So yes, but then I want to understand my own participation in that problem, because we are, in the end, only we can be responsible for our own salvation, I think, even under dire circumstances. I think of a poet at this point, say like Mahmoud Darwish, the Palestinian poet, whose poems from, you know, the Nakba from the earlier period are so expressive of this same spirit, I think, of finding hope and freedom by refusing to be locked into the cliches that one would be forgiven for or indulging in. Like that would, and forgiveness is one of the other gifts here. So one can forgive somebody for over-identifying with their victimhood, if you like. But in the end, that's not going to get you very far down the track. And in a poem, I don't think it's going to get anyone else very, very far, because it's just locked in to negativity. It's a kind of solipsistic cycle that perpetuates imprisonment to a large extent. So I guess I believe, and this is part of my, I think, unintended spiritual training as a young person in the Wesleyan tradition. It was other people's grief that we were taught to care for, not just our own. We might understand ourselves. And in fact, Methodism was a bit too harsh. I think I had people in my life who weren't sufficiently forgiving of themselves or other people, but the idea was service. And I think I simply carry that into my poetry work, that for other people, but really mostly first in the poem itself. I want to practice that kind of leaving behind of these fouled, what I call the fouled lines, which is a fishing reference, of course, too, but kind of stick one gets stuck And those lines, which you can read as poetic lines, you know, or lines of thought, if you like, in their inadequacy and stiffness and lack of fluidity, you know, and lyricism, can hold you into patterns of thought and action that are, in a sense, shrill and violent and help no one, including yourself. So, yeah, that was
So you're arguing that we need to choose our own narratives.
Yes, and that the narrative needs to be lyric, David. I'd take that the next line. That's why the story and the lyric play with each other in that poem. Pretty sure that's what Alice had in mind as well, because I think we indulge ourselves a bit these days in ideas of story without really investigating them much. A poem is not a story. It will have storylines in it, but it's actually a complex interweaving of lines or bits of story. But what it articulates is bigger than story, or fragments of story into which you read the connections and, you know, and the interactions. I've dwelled on that stuff a little bit before, but it's called a story, but in fact, it gives you little bits of it, doesn't it, that poem? And poems do that, you know, they ask you therefore, to imagine the worlds of connection or the thoughts that the poet maybe had in mind, just as you're asking me these questions. Now, if there are too many questions and not enough possible answers, or if the questions are too thorny or not interesting, or the poem doesn't give you enough delight, then it will fail as a poem too. So poetry is tricky in that regard. Like, I don't need myself as a reader of poems to understand everything in a poem. But if I, one, don't understand much, and two, don't find it very delightful, I'm just going to put it down. It's not useful.
Yeah, except that, I mean, it yields more if you give it more time and more thought and more attention and more readings.
Yes, well, that's the reader's duty, but we ask too much of readers too often. The poet's duty is to beguile and to hold. Sure, ask questions, but why would anyone stay in my poem? That's a question I think a few too many contemporary poets are not bothering themselves with. You know, we're very concerned with articulating our own ideas or thoughts, but not giving readers enough help. I mean, let's be honest here, all of us are too busy. We don't have heaps of time of the kind that poetry wants us to have, and we should practice that. But I tend to be invited and allowed to slow down enough and to practice patience by a poem that makes me laugh and makes me weep a bit, or gives me a line that makes me go, I understand it more or less, and wow. That, you know, wonder has to be ignited. I do think it's something that 20th century poetry has forgotten about too much, and that is the way in which poetry is a human connection practiced in language, in which, as Horace once said, you know, the function of literature in a sense is both to instruct and delight. Delight, remember that one? So what would that be like if I weren't merely thinking of myself and my own needs? And of course, this is where form comes in, because we have to know that every poetic culture, every culture on the planet has developed forms, and they're all musical. They all have music in them. So when in the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of people turned their backs on musicality in poetry, we traded a lot away. And I'm pretty sure that most of the time we haven't compensated enough for the absence of that. Sometimes I think if we want to understand why heaps of people are writing poetry, but next to nobody's reading it, we might look in that area, because it's not speaking enough to deep human needs that aren't constructed by any time and culture or gender or anything else. They're deeply human needs.
Yeah, well, I still think there's room to make the reader do a bit of work.
I'm not saying there isn't, but I think we need to do the work first. Like, we mustn't we? And I think you can think a bit too arrogantly and too glibly about the work that we're putting readers to. Like, delight, it's a very important thing to spark. That's your duty. It's our duty to, I think, be interestingly clear, to be radically clear about things. Mostly lack of clarity simply doesn't help. So it seems to me to be a bad horse to back.
Yeah, well, so I see it as like, well, here is a poem, here is an open field, go wander.
Yeah, so why am I going to wander in that field? Why am I going to wander as a reader?
Have a look around. There's,
yeah,
there's the birds, and there's the blue skies, and there's this and there's that, you know, I mean.
If there are those skies, then that's wonderful. Like, I've given you a lot of chooks and stuff to give people things. It's the kind of very intellectual poem that doesn't give the soul anything to catch on. The soul loves the particular. So if you're giving me beaches, David, as you do, if you're giving me birds, if you're giving me phrases that are simply delightful, I don't have to understand them to stay, but you have to make me want to stay. That's our duty. That's a poet's duty.
All right. I think we can have a longer conversation about that another time, Mark, but I'll just ask you one more question about this poem before we go on to the next one. Is this poem also a warning to us not to be complacent about freedom, to understand that it is provisional, fragile, at risk, that we have to consciously work to keep the threats to it at bay, and that this is uncompromising work? As you put it, if freedom is the hardest edge to hold, this is how it's held, unbought, unsold.
Great question, simple answer, yes. That's it. There's a lot of work entailed in freedom, in trying to work out for ourselves what that means for us and everybody. And one thing that means in a personal life is honesty and openness, the willingness to dialogue with yourself and find yourself wrong and ask questions, and all of those things, as I frame them, of course, are social political responsibilities as well. Democracies die in darkness. Democracy dies when one side thinks it has all the answers and wants to cancel and stomp on all the others. Democracy is the capacity to disagree with each other civilly, as you and I were just doing, I think, and to be both insistent and humane, to practice, levity and gravity. Yeah, freedom. It's often been written about, and what that means exactly is hard to say, but the sense that one was able within profound bounds to find a way to live in a society in which others and oneself could practice authenticity and be allowed to do that. And a fair bit more of that work is about border protection, if you like, boundary writing, insistence on the values that must be upheld, including the need for people to be allowed to disagree with each other, but the obligation to be civil. So, to go back to what we were just talking about, we often think about, the invitation into the poem for people to be free to do something without thinking about our obligations that are going to engender that. So, yes, it's about, I suppose, the disciplines of freedom and the argument that if we want to know what those look like, we might look out the window and beyond the human a little bit more often at the birds and at the practice of nature, and also musicality, like keeping alive in any utterance that we think to make a sense of levity as well as gravity, of musicality, not just ideology. Those ideas are in there, I guess, but you just asked me a good question and I'm putting ideas on the poem. I think they're in there because they're in me, I suppose. So yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Let's read another one.
On the theme of forgiveness, David, there's a poem I wrote called Lines for Late Winter. Now this, by contrast, formally is a free verse poem, classic free verse poem. I guess I'm channeling poets like Robert Gray, whose work I love, in this poem, in its shape as well as its setting to some extent. Lines for Late Winter, or The Reef Heron. I'm also thinking of Mark Strand, because this poem began in reading a poem of Strand's. I mostly love Mark Strand's work, and this one I did, and I was remembering it too found me over the wires, I think. Tell yourself, he begins, and his poem is called Lines for Winter, and he begins, tell yourself, as it grows cold and grey falls from the air, that you will go on, walking, hearing the same tune, no matter where you find yourself. Same themes playing up here, aren't they, David, really? So I begin by actually channeling into my first lines both his lineation and his exact words in the opening line, and then I walk into my winter, which was down the south coast of New South Wales at a place called Dolphin Point. I'm also thinking in this poem about the passage of my mother, and I think it was on this very day that turned very cold very suddenly that we were going up to inter my mother. So that was on my mind. And I feel as though I sat down to write a poem without thinking about any of that at all, because the Mark Strand poem invited me into the to the table. And then halfway through the poem, a bird I'd never in my life seen before suddenly appeared outside the window and ran away with the poem. Tell yourself as a reef of cloud swims in low across the estuary, like a contrapuntal tide, only that the weather is changing and the world is not yet coming to an end. Tell yourself as you walk with the dog onto the rock platform and around the point into the soft artillery fire of first rain, that it's the barometric pressure you feel in your right hip, not yet arthritis. And that's why your leg aches a little more sharply this morning. And tell yourself that if you are not as nimble among the rack and volcanic intrusions as your young dog among the oysters as the sooty oyster catcher, still you are alive and walking upright, and your bones are organ pipes in which fugues and ancient airs play and ancestors sing, and your feet among rock pools are not unlike your mother's feet all those years along the pedalboard, and that you will go on faring your way a while yet. And as curtains of squall close out the horizon, say to yourself softly that there will be many more curtain calls. And as the wind picks up and the rain band arrives like its own fan base, remind yourself that this is a moment of meteorology, a synoptic incident. This is not the rest of your life. Say again, as if you were swimming the rip-up river, that the deeper you drop into the end of winter, the closer the start of summer draws, and that you will go on, even though the rain falls hard now and the dog looks not unlike the kelp along the strand line. You will go on like the reef heron, making an elegant meal of the falling tide. And do not forget to tell yourself that every song that Cheetah Cheetah offers at dawn is not a song of farewell, and that, like the rain, a mosh pit now, you will set in. And like the tide, though you fall, you will rise. And like the she-oaks, you will inhabit your life inordinately, the way a forest inhabits a tree, the sky a bird, the whole world a moment, the ocean a shore. And your life will be your own life utterly, your soul a perfect fit for your days. And so it always will have been, or so these late winter lines, a long time coming into voice and making land, and spoken here in sand and rack and ripple, so these soft spoken lines would have you understand.
Oh, I'm still alive, and I'm grateful. I'm grateful to still be alive and to hear poetry like that. You mentioned Mark Strand. As you know, I'm a great admirer of Mark Strand's work as well. And I respond to his poems in some of my work, quite apart from the first lines of your poem being identical to the first line of the quote from Mark Strand. Can you say something about how your poem relates to or responds to his poem?
I think it's overtly, I realized reading it, that it's a poem like, of which he didn't write all that many, I think, but sort of overtly a wake-up call kind of poem. It's a kind of, come on, David, you can do better with your life kind of poem, speaking to himself. I think of it as a kind of Mary Oliver poem in a way, isn't it? Like
Note to self.
Note to self poem. And, you know, every one of us must write a poem like that. I think I write a few of them, but I just gave myself license to do that in the poem, I think. Configuring yourself in your moment as an instance of all human life, and hoping that the poem speaks. Actually had this poem did okay in the Newcastle Poetry Prize, and Judith Nola Crispin was reading it that year. And when she saw me, she said, I was dead sure this was a poem by an Indigenous woman. Isn't that fantastic? That is so fantastic. Except it might speak to a bit of bias, but a good bias. And what it means is that I think the poem actually goes deeper. All I'm trying to do is go, I'm 61, my hip is aching, I'm walking along the shore with the dog, I'm thinking of my mother, the bones and fugues, organ pipe references to mum, of course, but, you know, the delight is, as happened with Mark Strand's poem, I think, he thinks of himself, I think in that poem, he's actually goading someone else in their life to come on. The weather is grey and, you know, the winter passes. I don't know exactly. Do you, in fact, know the
No.
circumstances of that poem for him. Yeah, I didn't research them. I just, again, and I think this is what, I think it's the best response to a poem, don't you? Just to be delighted by it and to be encouraged by it. And if you're a poet, sometimes to be encouraged to write. And I think that instinct is the right instinct for poetry. It's a participation in the conversation. There's a degree of competition in it, I must say. Like sometimes I think, can I write a poem like that resembles that in its achievement? If I'm honest, you know, that's part of the start. But I think it was a sense of license I got from him just to sometimes write a poem that hopes to say some human things about leading a life with humility and grace and a sense of humor and you know, some sort of wisdom.
Yeah, I mean, with the repeated admonition, you know, in the poem, tell yourself. Yeah, it's a note to self, but it's even like a stock take. Here I am. This is where I am in my life, and I need to remind myself of things that I should be paying attention to perhaps pan back from the immediate and look at the big picture. And my sense is that a lot of your poetry can be characterized as very concerned with the big picture. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you can see references obliquely to climate change and you know, the general violence of things in the poem. Yeah, that's true. I think that, yes, I am deeply concerned, and nearly any poem of mine that I rate of my own has resonated a personal experience, mine or somebody else's, against a larger ecological or socio-ecological kind of spiritual concern. And the great challenge, I think, for the poet is to engage with that concern, which is what a lot of people will respond to in the poem, actually, because their life can never really be mine. They'll find some resonance of, say, you know, the equivalent of the arthritis in my right hip thing, or whatever. They'll go, oh, it reminds me of, you know, blah. Or they'll pick up the reference to, you know, the kind of climate change thing. And the poem is kind of saying, yes, sometimes it can occur to you that the weather's changing so fast that one fears for one's children and grandchildren. But what are we going to do? Like, apart from everything that should be done and isn't being done fast enough, one also has to find a way to live with hope and usefulness. And that's what I'm getting at. The practice of, I heard somebody once say, the great work is the small work, in fact. Certainly part of the great work is the small work. And this is a poem in that area, isn't it? Just to say, well, giving up's not an option. It just can't. And getting self-concerned and lost in your own circumstances isn't going to help many people either. So tell yourself, remind yourself, etc.
Yeah, I mean, saying, well, take some responsibility for how you're feeling and how you're going through the days, and if necessary, to pick yourself up and keep going. It's important. It's important work, and it falls to all of us to do. And it reminds me that we are often our own harshest critics. And sometimes if we're down, it's because we've put ourselves there. The poem reminds me a little bit of Stephanie Dowrick's book, Forgiveness and Other Acts of Love, where the chapter on forgiveness is all about first forgiving yourself.
Yeah. I love that book, actually. In fact, I love it very much. In fact, I think, David, coincidentally, the second book review I ever got published in the world, in the Australian or somewhere big, when I was moving away in my life from being a publisher to being a self-financing, you know, writer person. Well, I wrote a lot of book reviews, and I knew Stephanie Dowrick a little bit because we'd worked together at Allen & Unwin. And so when that book came out, I got it, and I got Jim Hall at the Australian, I think, to allow me to write a book review of it. And I love that chapter particularly. So I'm with you. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because we're on the theme of forgiveness here in my essay. And that idea is arresting to many people. These are not very forgiving times. These are very judgy times.
Yeah.
And when I uttered that, when I spoke these 6 gifts at the event in China, I forget exactly where we were now, but George Surtees was there. People would probably know George Surtees, a very considerable contemporary British poet, we think of him as. He's actually Hungarian, I think, born, though he writes in English. And he wanted to tackle me, not negatively, but furiously, about what I meant by forgiveness. Like, was I saying we should forgive everybody everything? And manifestly, I'm not. And you can tell in that poem, I'm not really. And I am trying to strike the note first and start close in, as David White says, like start close in. Like you've got to catch yourself out being a miserable old bastard and try and do a bit better, but also catch yourself out and go, come on, make yourself useful. But also at the same time, practice kindness. In the poem, I think the kindness to self is largely practiced through levity. You know, it's humor is a very, very important aspect of. I'm going to argue something here too, David, that you may or may not be with me on, but I think levity is so important to intelligence and to the work of poetry. Now, I don't want to argue just straight for light poems, but levity, a capacity not to take oneself or one's pain or anything so seriously that we forget the kind of ultimate light of existence is a problem in some poetry. And of course, the opposite of every writing instruction is also sometimes true. So I can think of some profoundly just out and out negative poems that almost are so furiously angry that they're almost funny again. But a balance of levity and gravity, because levity's got to do with forgiveness of self. I think it's about going, oh, well, hey. Well,
levity is not actually a natural thing to write. It's not that easy to do.
I don't find it unnatural at all, David. I think there's actually one of the gifts in my life. So what I think you might mean there, though, is that it's hard to learn, I think, if it's not a thing that's coming to the lines very naturally. It is hard to affect. It's like it's hard to turn yourself into Jerry Seinfeld overnight. You come out that way, I think. And I did, like, mate, it's so, that poem's got, well, all of our poems have family and ancestors in them, don't they? But my grandfather was a Methodist minister. Methodism in his day was a deeply serious matter. It was mostly about, you know, getting people off the grog, getting them to stop dancing and fornicating too much, and, you know, singing some hymns, and no alcohol, no dancing. That was part of his belief system. But he was at the same time a practical joker and a very delightful, funny man. So from him, I think I've learned in my bones something about gravity and levity. And also from Mum, it's got to be said, bless you, Mum. Mum was not really a very funny person. Humor didn't come naturally to Mum at all, but it showed up in her capacity to delight in music, I think, and in the music that she found delightful, particularly, say, Debussy, the music of, which I love as well, right up there at the top of the pops for me is Debussy. Just such intelligence. And I'd say it's there in Bach as well. There's kind of a capacity to joke musically and to subvert a little bit, but not to draw attention to myself and my serious intellect, but just to have fun, just to play a game. And I do think it's important, and it is hard to manufacture if it's not showing up, for sure.
It's interesting that you bless your mother, because I think this poem is not just about forgiveness, but connotes a sense of being blessed, of gratitude, you know, for all the gifts that come to us in life. How important is that theme in your poetry?
Thank you. Very important. I just quickly reread my essay this morning, David, because, you know, as usual, I remembered with 40 minutes to spare that I was on podcast this morning. So I'm actually in the thick of a really difficult, well, not difficult, but intense proofreading process for one of our books, a very important book, which I might mention later. But I thought, oh God. And I just happened to, when I printed the essay out, it fell open at the part where I speak overtly in that essay. I'd forgotten, before I get to the 6 gifts, I speak about maybe standing present and giving thanks. That's one of the things that clearly I valued enough to write it in to that essay. I would say, I'm thinking here also, speaking of levity, there's a wonderful clip of Hugh Grant, which I've seen more than enough times really now on Instagram, on my feed, where Hugh Grant, someone asks him, so Hugh, they know what the answer is going to be, right? They say, so Hugh, do you keep a gratitude journal? And Hugh Grant says, oh, don't be ridiculous. But of course, right at that moment, he's practicing a kind of loose gratitude for existence by joking, you know, by inducing laughter from us. So yeah, I think gratitude, to get back to that, one can get too serious about it, but I think what I'm getting at in that essay is that I like those essays that feel. Mary Oliver's an example, actually, and that poem of Strands is a good example, but you know that the poet's probably doing it hard. Like it was never easy for Mary Oliver to be kind. and nice. If you look at her background and what happened to her, if she were a contemporary poet, she'd be writing endlessly about her childhood trauma. And I love it in a way that instead she wrote poems that transcended, that actually transfigured trauma into beauty and kindness. So gratitude was a survival technique for her, I think, finding a world to which one could always belong, notwithstanding everything else that was wrong with oneself and one's mind. And that's the Indigenous idea of country too, I think, a sense of kinship with things way beyond the ego and even beyond the social, to which one has a connection that matters and that ought to be served in some way. And gratitude is a large part of how we do the service, just finding a way to go, would you look at that? Which is kind of what I'm doing in the poem in a way. Like, just look at this earth, look at the weather offshore. Yes, I know it's a sign also of unseasonal, kind of weather, but look at it, look at the beauty of that and the bird that arrives. Kind of acknowledgement of grace, I suppose, David, is a way of saying what I've been valuing there.
It's interesting that you mentioned Mary Oliver, because I was going to say that to many of us in our very urban lives, I'm thinking of myself here, although I'm surrounded by trees and birds and trains in the background, we become increasingly disconnected with the natural world, and that's a huge problem. Your poetry, and this poem is an example of it, with its numerous references to clouds and estuaries and tides and oysters and oyster catchers and rock pools and kelp, places the natural world at the heart of everything.
Yeah.
Tell me why that's so important to you.
There's like so many things here, that's simply who I am. So sometimes I don't want to say, I don't want to sell it to anyone. It's just, it seems to be how I'm configured. And I think I was even as a child. And actually, as you know, I grew up close to Beecroft. That's country where you are. That's changed a bit now, but there's still heaps of turpentine and the things that I enjoy as a boy. But actually, I kind of grew up with as much like anyone else in the suburbs, and the suburbs are an abstraction, really. So a lot of us in downstream of colonial cultures and suburban practices tend to grow up in what we feel as though we belong to is some kind of idea of family and community, and that's great, except it's sort of constructed in a way that ignores where it's set down. I was just dealing with a young poet last night at one of my classes who'd written a poem that, when I asked her, she told me it was written situated on the Central Coast in Arimba, I think, or somewhere, which I knew. And I said, I've got to say that there's absolutely no sense of the feel of that place in that poem at all. And that seems to me, and so I'm not judging you, like there's some learning that one needs to do, but it's bad for a reader to feel as though they're in the nowhere land in a poem, because that's what suburbia feels like, and it's what merely intellectual realms feel like as well. So I think kind of placification, to put it more broadly, is important to me. I argue often, and I know there are heaps of exceptions to this, but I find it hard to think of a poem that registers with me from across the cultures and across the ages and times that doesn't include the world beyond the merely human. And, there will be many, but look at that Mark Strand poem just for a start. Now, you don't have to go out and do a wilderness thing. It could be that your poem simply registers where you are in Surrey Hills or whatever, but it bothers with the world beyond the head. It bothers with the world beyond the abstract and the merely social. The social is really important, but I'm thinking for some reason here of Anna Akhmatova, writing under conditions of profound imprisonment, like you're getting at before, but still finding a way to give you a strong sense in why is it then we don't despair, that poem of hers. And it's got peach tree blossoms coming in, and even a sense of the industrial surrounds matter as well, because they're the ground. Like, we are organisms, we do live in a physical reality, and when we forget it in our poetry, the poetry is diminished, and the experience for a reader will be less than a well-lived life that might be. So those are the reasons. It just so happens that I think I find that work fairly easy to do. And I used to struggle in my early younger days when I knew I wanted to write. I didn't realize that you could simply kind of bear witness to where you were, and that would be literature. I thought you kind of had to come up with narrative arc and a whole bunch of things that they preach about, and you can do that if you want to. But you don't have to. And in fact, large tracts of the literature of the world are kind of witness statements about country, in a sense. And so I think I do perpetuate that tradition. The dog's wanting to come in again, David.
Well, I think we should perhaps get on to another poem. Otherwise, we're going to be doing a very, very long podcast.
Yeah, David, which is, no matter how good it is, too long is just too long, isn't it?
Well, no, I enjoy it, and I'm sure the viewers do too.
So the third poem I thought we'd share is a poem called Song of the Quiet Revolution, which was originally titled, which is now subtitled, Poem Written in Sudden Sickness on my 62nd birthday. So it starts as a whinge about catching COVID when I was hoping to be celebrating my birthday this year, actually. So this belongs to this period. It's written in a form called the 9x9x9, which is a modernist form, which I love since stumbling into it, mid-century American kind of form, especially Donald Hall and some other people. So 9 stanzas, each 9 stanzas got 9 lines. Each stanza has 9 syllables. So you're not counting beats here, just syllables. Starts with some words of Kim Stafford's, whom I mentioned before. Don't die before you die. It's possible, even in dark days, to wake in wonder. Lift your gaze. So there are 9 here, plus I wrote a coda. I cheated and wrote a 10th. 1, the white daisies I bought for tonight when I thought I'd share dinner with friends. Look like they think they've the whole summer ahead of them. I give them 5 days. Meantime, let them bloom in innocence, young women in summer frocks. Meantime, struck down with the flu on my birthday, I sit outside grumbling, and no bombs drop and no floods rise. How much worse, eh? 2. Oh, I've got something interesting happening with my printing here. I'm reading Ha Jin's Life of Li Bai. Perhaps my future's like Bai's, short pieces finely wrought from troubles and travels. The work is to do justice with one's life, with words, with whatever you've got, to the beauty that finds you and keeps you. The world will ail, see how it ails. If all we speak is power, if all we do is complain and want. 3, poetry is the revolution already. It always was. These soft bombs it throws, which take the legs out from under the overculture, as Orr calls it. Whatever else you must do to right what wrongs afflict us, recall the courage of the daisies, how short their lives. Find the song in the swift smile of the mother, pushing her pram through you, for walking past, when, sitting on the stoop, you shushed the dogs in case her baby slept. The revolution refutes all language, all action that denies life. It happens in your heart, at your door. It wants from you small good words for what loves you. It's how, notwithstanding, you love back. In case you forgot how, in case you forget how, walk often in trees, be with birds, dogs, horses too, are good at it, canter on one you love, as I do on mine, trying to make it look like sitting in the saddle at that speed, at this age, isn't hard. Rhythm's half of how the revolution works. The other half is how the books and rivers teach you how to see it and say it, how it's only once been said and seen. Now, I find it hard, this is part 6, I find it hard to believe Li Bai wrote so well, so drunk. I must have been drinking the wrong stuff. Intoxicate each moment with your being in it. Even this one, the afternoon sky thick as thought and my mind overcast. I'll try that. We are as passing cars, as cut flowers, as the cries of bright birds. Many don't get the chance you have. 7, so start, I guess. The world has asked you like the whipbird I heard in the trees at the lapsed quarry again today. And what do you suppose you will have to answer? What will your life be? What use will you find for your years? Don't stop wondering. Listening's a calling I commend. Too many have signed up for talking and nothing good to say. 8. I never saw such dying, they say, thinking of what should be called the rape of Gaza. But there was such dying, often the rape of Nanking, Mile Lake, Hiroshima, Pol Pot. We learn nothing, and nothing is as violent as ignorance, and how easily it's misled. And all that goes wrong starts in language. That's a calculus of power. 9. Reading Levi's life got me thinking, although every moment won't be right, write more often, small things, trust yourself. The revolution of love rolls out in short verses, in minutes. There, now, the yellow-tailed black cockatoo wails lyrics as it flies, drunk with grey skies, and anyone who hears them hears grief and delight at once. A birthday rag. And then I wrote this little coda, which is cheating, but this is the one I meant to write first, actually. Or else, let's end the poem like this. Last time I was ill, Mum was still here 2 years ago. How fast life passes, how long death stays. And now my father sits on the couch with reruns, tennis. Coffee? He comes to the deck to ask. Mum would be pleased with him. She'd be pleased with me. In the birches, the koel starts. Behind my back, the mountain smiles.
Well, there's a lot in that, isn't there? You mentioned that this poem is about the gift of hearthing. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Oh, yeah, that's right. It's the gift of hearthing, which is the third gift. I guess I thought that this poem got at that because it's set on a kind of close to literal hearth. I'm sitting quite close to the center of the house as I write the poem. It's a domestic space where I belong, and I had intended to make my house a hearth that night for other people who would come around, and now can't. So I'm trying to make the connection through the poem that hearths make in real life. So a hearth is the fire inside. That's the critical idea. The hearth is where you bring a wildness inside and domesticate it. So it's a metaphor for poetry, in my view. You bring the wildness inside and make it habitable. And you turn wildness into utility, like it keeps us warm. And then around the hearth, in safety, if we're lucky, we get to share each other's company, and it's a kind of fellowship. And I hope and feel in my own reading that good poetry invites me into it, into the fellowship of all being, or human being in a sense. And so then I'm reflecting, ironically, in a sense, that after all that hope and ambition, I find myself alone. But actually, that would be sentimental. That would be indulgent to think that way. So I'm trying again to goad myself out and go, the revolution's going on even in solitude at the page here. You can make a contribution to the perpetuation of good things in life if you try. Smile at the woman across the road pushing the stroller down the road, and forgive the dogs for barking too much, and hear the koel, which is a kind of an annoying suburban bird, but just as beautiful as anything else in creation, really. And it did strike up its note right at that time to remind me of the beauty and cruelty that coexist in nature, because of course the koel is a nest stealer, the cuckoo that pushes the other eggs out and leaves its eggs, and then the other birds do what we humans find it so difficult to do, and that's bring up someone else's children. We're good with our own, but we find other people's children should be other people's business, is the truth at the heart of a lot of this understanding. So yeah, hearthing has those ideas. I guess sometimes I say poetry is an accompanied solitude. It seems to me that it writes one's solitude as an instance of all such solitude, and therefore invites all of us, actually or possibly, reading, to inhabit the same space at once of our common humanity.
And then you bring your mother and your father into it, so it's the hearth of family as well.
Yeah, that's right. And there's Dad's gesture at the end of, bringing the coffee out, which is always very much in our structure of family, and Mum and Dad's, that would have been Mum's role. And so he's offering me a coffee where, I'm normally the coffee maker and the offerer of coffee, and I'm sitting outside. Dad was suffering too. Actually, he was not suffering at all. I was suffering. He just had a diagnosis. He was positive apparently, but manifest absolutely zilch symptoms. And I didn't have any either. But yeah, those are references, I guess, to to the hearth. And not far from where I was sitting is the kind of literally a hearth, of course, is that fireplace. And the house that we're lucky enough to live in has, because I live in a coldish place, it's got a wood burning stove at the center of it. And I was sitting right beside the pile of wood that I'd stacked up. But it's not needing the fire on that particular occasion, but, you know, observing it and reflecting on it. Yeah, the familiar, I guess.
The epigraph by Kim Stafford with its opening line, don't die before you die, is again an admonition to make the most of life.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of Yevgeny Yevtushenko's phrase, don't die before your death. And it seems necessary to state again and again because it seems many people do. As Kurt Vonnegut put it, live out the stories of their lives, but arrive at the epilogue long before the end. You encapsulate this idea with the line, intoxicate each moment with your being in it. Yeah. This is the notion of being present in each moment. What does that require of us other than our attention?
Yeah, attention's the first word that you come up with in answer, I guess. Presence. Mary Oliver talks about, you know, she says, I think somewhere the present is all we have. You know, this is it. You know, life is it's kind of what I was going with. Story is what we read back on things later, but the experience of being alive is a succession of presences, each of which includes possibilities and remembrances, but it's right here now. And the chief duty she goads us to, and wherever she writes that, one of her poems, and that Yevtushenko's got in mind, and Stafford here, who I think references Yevtushenko in his poem. So we're all engaging in the very hearthness of poetry here in a way. The idea is that presence is a practice, I suppose, and it might entail some things like getting over yourself enough, forgiving yourself for not getting over yourself fast enough, and then getting over yourself a bit, and the kind of things I'm talking about in the poem, each of which is a synecdoche, an instance of all such things, like get on a horse, walk in the quarry, wave at the woman next door, get your dad a cup of coffee, like do little things, practice the small things in which gratitude and I guess kindness and a practice of community are a kind of practice. Don't forget to be kind to yourself, forgive yourself for that kind of thing, noticing the light, which is attention, I suppose, and I guess reimagining quickly each moment as happening within a set of concentric circles, if you like, in which many things are happening at once. And you're just inhabiting one moment of it. But, you know, Gaza gets mentioned in that piece. History gets mentioned in it. Mum's death gets mentioned in it, and just the look of the mountain in the light. So I think that kind of idea, again, Indigenous cultures are wiser at this than the adolescence of colonial cultures, which tend to emphasize narrative lines about success and progress and getting on and changing things. But Indigenous cultures have been much wiser about reminding us that that happiness and belonging and usefulness in a life happen as a practice, perpetual practice of sustained interconnection with human and more than merely human things. So yes, that's how I'd expand your idea of attention, but that's it essentially.
There's a massive forgetting going on, isn't there?
Yeah.
Where technology is replacing presence, and people are immersed in their screens or whatever they're immersed in, and actually mostly not present.
That's it, David. I think that's true. We don't want to sound like a couple of grumpy old men here, but it is true, and it's a visceral thing. Like I find myself getting furious now. You can't move on Zoom, for example, or I was on Zoom last night, and we are again today. You can't get rid of the box that wants you to use AI. Like this stuff is being shoved down our throats, and I fear for us because it's the antithesis of what we're talking about here. Presence, you know, like occupying, as I said in the other poem, like occupying yourself utterly. If you can, that's an impossible goal, but doing your best. The way that it seems to us, at least, that birds do and trees do and kangaroos, you know, on the plain, they're simply being themselves. They're not looking at their phones and living another life. But it is true, and I feel it viscerally, don't you? Like I find myself being caught out in what they call the rabbit hole these days and just scrolling down, and I kind of wake up and I go, oh God, that's terrible. Like I've not been present for the last 30 minutes, and it feels like I've let the side down.
Well, we're getting divorced from our own instincts.
Yeah.
which is problematic, as you say. I think equally significant in Kim Stafford's epigraph are the words "to wake in wonder," and this is something that we did naturally as children, right? But we've lost it. The burdens accumulate, the responsibilities accumulate. So, is this poem in a way saying, "Hey, reclaim your inner child"?
Yeah, maybe. I find when I think of my own childhood, I think that's true for me, David. Sounds like it might have been for you. And I think it's an aspect of childhood. But of course, a lot of children actually are pretty terrible at wondering. They're mostly good at complaining about things or being grumpy, or they have a terrible time in their life. And so wonder is hard work for children as well. But actually, Mary Oliver's a good example there again, because she had a terrible childhood and actually turned to wonder, which never completely disappeared from her as a way of staying alive, to be honest. Yeah, wakefulness, certainly. I found myself thinking this thought last night in relation to somebody else's work. I was trying to find an edit, and oh yeah, she'd written that my father was always young at heart, that expression. And in a poem, I was trying to get her to rephrase it, because that's what we mean, but it's a bit cliched and overused, but the meaning is right. And so I was thinking about, well, in a way, it's kind of like she meant for her father that even at 96, he could still be playful with the kids and still was writing poems and still turning up to help her, do the decorating and stuff like that. So life beyond his own self and head continued to matter, and he wanted to be part of it. And wonders a bit about that. It's got to do with the gratitude thing we were talking about before. And I think with imagination, and as you said beautifully, I think remembering not to forget, remembering not to get stuck in forgetfulness, I suppose, just going, there's always more going on at this moment that's joyful or just plain interesting than I'm recalling at this moment. I actually stood under a tree the other day, and I had a quite profound visceral sense of this. I looked up at one of the eucalypts by the dog park, and I just thought, sadly, I just don't have enough years in my life ever to even explore that tree, like in its intricacy, like all the leaves, and even to notice all of the kind of branches. And that's just one thing. And then I feel a kind of beautiful melancholy that's got attached to it. Number one, don't forget to try. But number two, we're going to fall short of our apt appreciation of just the diversity and wonder of things, human and non-human.
Is poetry for you a vehicle for wonder?
Yeah, it's a way of getting some of that done, isn't it? I think it certainly is for me. That's obviously not the only thing it's there for, but it's important, I think. Like a lot of my articles of faith, I guess, about poetry have to do with don't forget delight, don't forget musicality, don't forget practices that aren't strictly speaking necessary, for just survival. In fact, the argument would be that wonder is necessary for survival, and that wonder is a discipline, in fact. And in poetry, it is actually often the starting point, the trigger, if not what the poem's about. A poem for me, I think it's true for many poets, but certainly for me, like I've got one in this book of Rosanna McGlone's we're doing at press called The Making of a Poem, where 11 of us, John Kinsella, Anthony Lawrence, Judy Beveridge, Nala Crispin, and some other Australian poets, allow an early draft to be looked at, and then the final draft to be seen, and we talk about how it got to be thus. And the opening question that Rosanna asked each of us was, where did this poem come from? Why this poem? Like Gavin Gow is saying, I was responding to the fires afflicting at that stage central Queensland where he'd grown up. Other people, it's an idea that very often, like Kinsella, who writes a poetry so different from mine, it can't be imagined. But nonetheless, his poem begins in watching an owl take off and fly, and mine began just in looking out the window from my desk. And the phenomenon of the light across Gundungurra Country at that stage that's where the poem began. And then an idea that I'd kind of get that said something, like get something said about that witnesses it, and it pays respect, and then reflects on all or some at least of the complexity that's entailed in that one incredibly large moment.
Yeah, I mean, you've said how, some of these poems have begun in a place of depression. It's almost like you write towards wonder.
Yeah.
And actually you can lift yourself out of a bad place through the act of writing poetry.
Yeah, I think I was saying when I was putting my last collection together, I need to stop that as the trope of my poetry making. But then again, actually, it is the beginning, like an act. Malava, it's Yevtushenko, it's often the beginning. It's often the seed, I think. Like Larkin comes to mind here as well. And he says, let us be kind while there is still time. He's just had a horrific experience of mowing over. What's that poem called? That's the animal, isn't it? The one that lives inside the grass. The stoat, the mole, is it? I forget. Anyway, and he says, "Let us." So it's an attempt, yes, to rise up out of, not all poems, of course. Jerry Manley Hopkins come to mind. Oh, the mind has mountains, cliffs of fall, frightful sheer, etc. So I wouldn't want to prescribe that though. But it's part of the practice of wonder, I think, is to allow ourselves to catch ourselves out, just wandering in the world, or in love or whatever, and starting there and getting that done. And to be honest with you, it was almost with that poem the opposite, because it began in inhabiting the wonder, and then the wonder took me back to the grief that I was feeling.
Yeah.
And then I arrive at a point of grace. And that, I haven't read that poem, so that won't make sense to people, but I start in the light. I recollect my mother's passing, and I end on a note that goes, in this light, I both mourn the time already when my time is going to have been over, but don't, like Yevtushenko, but just don't forget, don't not Yevtushenko, that was your other guy, wasn't it? Don't forget the present moment. Don't live the epilogue before you've lived the life itself. Don't be Icarus in the fall, be Icarus in the flight.
Yeah.
And so it can work in different ways, David, but I guess if it often works that way, then that would speak to a very important need for readers, I think, because we often turn to poetry for that reason, I think, often without knowing that's what we're doing. But as Ethan Hawke, I think, in that thing, a lot of people have probably seen online, says, a lot of people don't go around these days wondering what the hell David Adès is doing in his poetry life, or, whatever. We just poetry. And I think that's a problem, as he does too. I think we should think about, why am I not reading poetry much more often than we do? But the fact is we don't. And that was always probably the case. But what happens when your heart breaks? What happens when your mother dies? What happens when you have to write a eulogy? Where does pretty much everyone turn? Poetry. Sadly, too many people stop at bad pop songs these days, but even those people will often think that a poem is an appropriate way to read, by reading or by writing, to understand their grief, understand their broken heart, and find some transfiguration of that into a habitable kind of wildness of feeling. So I think it's one of the uses of poetry that's important. Yeah.
Now I have more questions about this poem, but I think we're going to run out of time. So perhaps we should get on to the next one.
The next one also comes from Walking Underwater. It's a poem called Cedar, more or less a free verse poem. One of the poems I wrote in a suite that that came to me when I was a poet laureate in 2016, I think, not poet laureate, a poet in residence at the Sydney Botanic Gardens. And this reflects on the cedar. The idea that it's got in mind is the idea of survival. Cedar. They gave themselves away flaming in rainforests, rising stark through open canopies, a gouache of green and grey. They wrangled them, these mahoganies, used furniture in waiting, architraves and finials and chairs. They spotted them and downed them, these unwitting colonial fittings hiding out in geologic time. They rounded them up from mountainsides, the future perfect, imminent in their past continuous selves. They drove them from the gullies and flooded them downstream. They slipped them from these former worlds to new cities on the plains, too good to leave standing in a land of recalcitrant trees, too much like a prophet to let be. The forests that lost them lose them still. Their grieving never ends. They miss the cedar's lyric trick of dying again more beautifully each new season than the last. And they still ring, the widowed forests, as if waiting for their pasts. And beneath this one, spared the sore and islanded here, survivor of a genocide of limbs, I feel lonely for the forest the tree never knew, for parts of me and all of us felled before we grew.
So, and this one's on the theme of survival, but can we not question the gift when what survives is so diminished?
The choice of the poem here, I guess, is an argument about realism, I suppose, isn't it? You know, like it's a notwithstanding kind of poem that acknowledges that so much is lost. And to be honest, where are the dinosaurs these days? You know, things pass. Not everything does survive, and yet we need to find a way to carry on in the face of all that passes and all that we lose. That's the spirit of the poem, I suppose. That's a much sadder poem, isn't it? Like it's a finding identification with the sadness of that poem standing there without its kin, because largely the cedars have disappeared from the forests in Australia because we overfelled them. This is one that fortunately got landed in a botanic garden, and it's still alive, but it's all on its own. So it's an exploration of the feeling of what it might be to be untethered from most of what you knew and most of what you loved, and yet still find a way to go into stoic kind of argument for survival here, isn't it?
I'm interested in your choice of the word they throughout the poem. You know, they wrangled them, they spotted them and downed them, they rounded them up, they drove them from gullies and flooded them and so on, which seems to put things at a remove, Mark. I mean, aren't all of us they? Aren't we complicit? Why did you choose they rather than we?
Yeah, I don't know. I actually don't know. It struck me as I read the poem to you as well. So I respect it because it chose me, I think. And the they is multiple in there. It's mostly the people, our people, really, you know, who, and that's what you're arguing for, that they're like had I been a more reflective person, I would have implicated myself in the violence there. Of course, overtly, I haven't not, of course. It's just acknowledging that there was a past. I think I'm putting the past in there. It probably explains why that the third person plural suggests itself rather than the first person. Well, I think it might have also been structurally because I felt that poem did arise from occupying one human's presence in that moment downstream of all that, I think. And so there was a sense of removal from, which was the derivation for the poem. But yep, that's right. I find myself being the person who's often arguing, you know, it's no good that we just put the rape of Gaza down to the Israelis or the Americans. That's our tragedy there. We who inherit the benefits and, you know, live now downstream of changes are connected with what's gone before. So I don't mean that to be ruled out of the poem, but on the other hand, I suppose it's speaking of a time past, disconnected from a present time for the tree, actually, which is disconnected from its past. And it's a marvelous thing in the poem. Like I got to thinking about that. Like they used to spot the cedars because among all of that gouache, as they say, the gouache of green and gray, the cedar stood out and it was vulnerable because it bucked the system. You know, its leaves turned, and so it was sightable from a long way off. They used to spot them in the canopy from a distance and then go in and fell them. So it's about vulnerability, I guess. And the poem is not saying don't shine, don't stand separately. It's just saying, I guess, so it goes. If you stand out, expect someone to try and knock you down. It's a great Australian trick, isn't it?
Tall poppy syndrome. It's a lament.
Yeah, it's a lament. That's
for all things lost.
Yeah.
Do you think that in the modern era, given what we're surrounded by, we do or should feel more complicit in such losses?
Yeah, if it helps, I suppose. I think it does help, but there's a risk that people might feel disempowered, I suppose is the word they'd use these days by that, you know, being asked to bear responsibility for something that they themselves didn't prosecute. People often argued that against the referendum for the Indigenous voice, for example, and one needs to be sympathetic to that, but also push back against it. If you're happy to take the benefits, then you need to know that you bear all downstream effects from what precedes it. Blame is not the point there, because don't
I'm not thinking of blame.
the gift of forgiveness there, but imagination and responsibility are important there. I think that's an aspect of growing up, into our full maturity, not hiding away and pretending that reality doesn't include things that we don't want to confront. So that would be an aspect of spiritual maturity, I guess, that yes, you'd want to encourage, and also have the conversation and practices. I hope maybe that poem does a proper form of lament. I mean, it's true across cultures, isn't it? Indigenous cultures and, say, Middle Eastern cultures, that lament is an honored and intelligent practice central to those cultures. And I think it's often said, and I think it's largely true, that colonial cultures have been weak on lament, because it's not the place they want to dwell, because they don't.
There's a lot of places they don't want to dwell. They don't want to dwell on complicity either.
Well, but this is what I mean. Like, you can't do lament for things that you've caused very easily until you take responsibility for it. And so that's why. But colonial cultures for so long just dwelled in the place of progress, and there were presumptions that the old was primitive and gone. And so every forest felled was an improvement. Of course, that was a bizarrely stupid idea even at the time, but it's a very adolescent idea. It belongs to adolescence in our human lives. And some people have argued that that's the place at which colonizing capitalist cultures are kind of stuck in their adolescence, which is one of the reasons why we do lament so badly.
I mean, it's a cop-out, but I was thinking of, I think complicity is complex because it's easy to be overwhelmed by it, but I'm thinking of it in terms of fueling greater action to save and preserve what is left.
Yeah, that's right. Betting. It's almost like we were saying before about the poems, like, to begin, it's a place to begin, acknowledgement of, what's lost, and then you can rise from it. In fact, one of the functions of poetry is also one of the functions of lament, which is to practice a ritual in which poetry is co-opted, and rhythm and musicality and honesty are co-opted to just spend some time doing sorry business. That's what Indigenous cultures are. And when that's done, you don't keep doing the sorry business every minute. You move back with some healing having been performed into the harder work. Well, not harder, into the other work of living your life and doing some good and doing better next time. But sorriness is part of the genesis of activism, I think, is what you'd maybe say there.
I think it can be. And we're getting, as time goes by and the science becomes more developed, we're getting an understanding that trees and forests are part of a network that does have lines of communication between them, as if the forest is itself a bigger organism than the individual trees in it. So the notion that, as you put it, the forests that lost them lose them still, their grieving never ends, I think is a really pertinent sort of observation. But you're also here referring to our grieving, which seems both endless and overwhelming, as exemplified in the last two lines of the poem. I feel lonely for the forest the tree never knew, for parts of me and all of us filled before we grew. What is your thinking in drawing this connection between the grieving forests and our own grieving?
Kinship, I think, essentially. Just mostly that there's merit and wisdom in understanding one's own feelings as belonging to the same field of experience as the trees might. And as you say, the science of that now is that we're learning that science respects ideas that have been understood for a long time outside of Western science about something in communities of trees that goes very close to resembling consciousness, very close to being what we think of as the human preserve of emotion and sympathy and that kind of thing. So the poem is completely unself-conscious, I think, about that stuff, although maybe not, because I had been doing some of that reading at that time. But you could arrive at that outcome, as Indigenous poetry does, and as Persian poetries do, that sense of kinship with things beyond the human without any science getting involved in it. But I think many of us in the West still suffer. I see it from the feeling that what's going on in the forest is we can't know it, and it's not relevant. It's not the most important thing. The human is every time for us the most important thing, and I do believe we've got to push back against that idea and reframe our human experience without diminishing it. In fact, the argument of some of the American nature writers who were very influential on me is that we practice our humanity more deeply and profoundly when we relocate it, when we uncenter it from ourselves, when we center it again, or actually decenter it, when we just place it back down in the community of all beings. And that poem is doing that, I suppose.
All right. Do you want to read another one?
Sure, David.
I'm going to say, of course you want to read another one.
Of course I do. I've got a poem here called The Age of Stars, which is on the theme of reconnection. This poem is a cycle of 4 sonnets. There it is, actually written to someone called David. As it happens, it might have been you, David, but it wasn't.
I doubt it.
It was a commission, actually, a delightful thing that happened in the church community. Someone I didn't know that well said, how much would it cost me to get you to write a poem for Dave's 60th birthday? And then I knew Dave, like, he's not a close friend. I had to do a bit of research with her about his passions and interests and so on, and then just take the imaginative leap. So it's set locally here. Little Mountain is the mountain under which I sit right now. Mittagong, or the Jib, is what we call that. Dave and Liza live just around the corner. He's a mathematician, statistician, banker who also can quote more poetry at me than anyone I've ever met. So he's an interesting being. It's got a couple of setups. That's the Larkin poem I've got there, and a passage of scripture which goes, and the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehendeth it not. Such beautiful poetry, those words. The Age of Stars. 1. On Little Mountain, deep in winter, stop the car at midnight. Stand among the gathered bands of barrel gums and contemplate the sky. This is the age of stars, this many billion-yeared experiment in light, when nearly all the matter in the world, this universe of forms and voids we are, is organized in luminescent mobs, like those assembled on the plains of time above our heads. Our being here at all is down to them. Their coming and their going, the way their being comprehends the dark. So while this holds, stand glad among the living and let your breathing fall in with the stars. 2. The era's age, all light in time will dim. Then nothing much will happen, on and on. But let's agree forever has a few more miles in its old legs. Let's make a pact to sow the light that's left to us. Let's scatter all the starlit matter we can spare. Let's dance quite often with the one we love. Let's wage iambic warfare on the prose that dumbs the days. Let's praise in jazz and think in syncopated rhythms like the winds of early spring. Let's ebb like aging stars, you say. Let's spend our waning energy among the constellations of our care. Let's learn to fall the way we meant to live. 3. Beside the pool, across the tracks from where you've lately made your home, an episode of winter rain makes landfall like a meteor strike among the teeming white of prunus trees, as if to flush their seraphs out. But when you wake into the 7th heaven, the cielo de seterno of your way, your contemplative era, your temperate zone, you'll find above the multitude of fallen a throng of thriving stars intact. The nearer it seems you draw to the stars, the farther from home, the more you get to weep at the comedy of life. But the more, if you're smart, you learn of the love that burns in the sun and all the aging stars.
So I'm tempted to ask you, Mark, how much does it cost to commission a poem? No one's ever asked me, and I'm not sure that I would be able to do it.
Actually, Somebody, I'll give you a pretty close guesstimate here. I don't want to give the game away, but once years ago, let me say this, somebody fairly wealthy, a specialist practitioner of medicine, asked me how much it would cost to write a love sonnet, right, for his beloved. And I thought about that for a while. I also thought about the more important question about how one can write a commissioned poem. Is that possible, particularly when the subject is love? And I thought, painters did it. Plenty of poets have done it across the time. I think that's a noble enterprise. So what am I going to tell them? But the cost, you know what I thought? 14 lines hath a sonnet, 100 lines a line plus 100 for consideration. That's what I charged. But it took me days, of course. Why should a sonnet not cost $1,500 when it cost me 4 or 5 days of work and opportunity cost? And the funny thing was with that poem, for a long time, I saved it in my laptop as the poem that's buying me Christmas because I wrote it in early December, I think this time of year, for someone, and it saved my bacon because poets don't tend to earn a lot of money all that often. So I bore that in mind when I wrote this one for Liza, and she said, tell me the proper kind of price, because she and David have no kids and they're both earning quite a bit of money from their careers, and so I felt no need to discount. But it's such an interesting thing, you know, like the value of poetry, isn't it? It's a larger question here, but economics or market forces will always, nearly always, do a terrible job of getting anywhere near paying what poetry is worth. And we shouldn't expect it to, because that system doesn't work. We just need to find another way to pay the poets, David. That's the problem.
Well, I mean, it's a beautiful poem, and I think if someone had written that one for me, I would be quite happy to receive it. Was it well received?
Yeah. He loved it. I mean, the challenge for me as a poet is to write it so that it transcends its circumstances. There are some lines in there, like Dancing with Your Wife, he and Liza dance, but we can get that, can't we? Like Dance with the One You Love, quite often. That's kind of a nice enough line. There's a bit of he did say that thing, I think, about, spending it while you've got it or something. I quote him saying, you say, let's ebb like aging stars. We'd both seen the same program on TV where Brian Cox does the big, kind of cosmology thing that kind of just does your head in. And he said, we live in the age of stars. It wasn't always bright in the universe, and it won't always be. And it just so happens that we occupy a position when there's light in the universe, and that won't always be the case. And you think, holy hell. And so it was well received. He loved it, and they framed it, and it's on their wall.
Beautiful. Now you start this poem off with 3 epigraphs, and I've noticed that you use epigraphs in a lot of your poems. Can you say something about your use of epigraphs, how they inform and enhance your poems?
One thing is that so much of my poetry, accidentally, it feels to me, begins out of somebody else's. Like I read something and it sparks a poetic response. And I've learned to value that, because I do think we're doing what we can. You're doing what you can. All poets are doing what they can to take part in the conversation, to use your term before. But it is remarkable to me how often the poem begins because of the quote. This one almost did, because the last one is from John, and that's about light and darkness, and you can see how I play with that. The first one is from Dante, "D'amor che muove il sole e l'altra stella," which is a line. I thought I wanted to end with that. I end with a line that riffs fairly closely to that, because the Dante line, Dante's under my feet here, Dante, that means the love that moves the sun and all of the other stars, is how that translates, and my line's quite close to it. And the reference to seventh heaven is also a Dante reference in the last stanza. Now that's a reference I wouldn't, it's an epigraph I wouldn't always include, and it's a reference I wouldn't always make. But Dave knows his Dante, and so I knew that in that context, it was safe. When I haven't published this poem beyond that, and I will, and that's another question, isn't it? Like, how much liberty does a poet then have to include this poem in their work, like we're doing today, without specific permission? But I have got general permission from, they understand that the deal is they get first publication rights, essentially, and everything else. Epigraphs, though, I do often use them. So it's the conversational thing. It's just it's an act of gratitude, I think, David, in a way, because I'm just going, I need you to understand, you people who might ever read my poem, that nothing starts from nothing. And this one didn't either. There are ideas that were on my mind when I made the poem, and I wanted to pay my dues in a way, but also it's another way of not putting notes in the poem sometimes, because it would be good if I didn't have to explain some things. And if a reader's got the Dante and the John and the Larkin before they begin, then when they encounter some passages in the poem, they'll go, that now registers. So it does inform a reading, and it's why poets across the ages have, one of the reasons why they've often put epigraphs at the top of poems, is so that the reader will understand that there's a field of reference here.
Do you want the readers to go back and check out the originals as well?
I'd love it if they did. That's just a good thing. That's another duty, I think, isn't it? Like, you want them to read your own poetry, but actually increasingly as I write, I more want them to read poetry. It's much more important for all of us in society and for mental health reasons and everything else to reacquaint ourselves however we can with the world of poetry. So yeah, if that started here in this poem, I'd feel pretty happy about that.
With our lives under pressure these days from so many quarters, it's easy for us to be immersed in the demands and practicalities of daily living. This poem pans back from that. We've talked about the big picture, and expands its scope to the universe, to the age of stars and the continuum of time. It wants us to look at the big picture, to perceive ourselves as part of something vast and majestic. Why is that important?
We talked a bit about this before, didn't we? But like, I suppose, so I've got in mind here that image I gave you of the pond dropping in the water, and just like the endless concentric circles that we might see ourselves, if we wanted to, as occupying. So I've got another poem where I say, think of your life in place, not time. It's the kind of secret to eternal life in the end. If I am an aspect not of time but of place, then I always will have been. Time gets in the way of our sense of ourselves a bit, because it makes us anxious. We have to hurry to get things done, and we're going to die and all of that. So part of the invitation to reimagine yourself in a vaster field is a way of making you feel grateful, but also consoled in a very deep way, that you're belonging. We are star stuff, as has been famously said, and the stars are in us, and we're in the stars. We always will have been. That I find the thought consoling. But I think also that can then be helpful, because all of us need to find a level of ease in our life from which we can then be better fathers, better partners, better participants in our communities, and so on. And for me, some of the consolation comes to me from reading and from being like I was in that poem. That the beginning of the poem coming home from Sydney late one night. I took the back road and was on the very top of the Jib, the little mountain, Mittagong, and looking up and seeing the stars through the trees. That moment is still alive in me, and I can kind of refer to it when I'm feeling shrill, as I was this morning, and you just go, yeah, I am that again. If you can just notice at the time, write the poem, maybe have the experience and remember that it's an experience you're having, you can return to it. There's always a hope, I suppose. Mostly the poem just proceeds from, commission in this case, but also gratitude and participation. But I guess one hopes that it makes a reader not so much come to Bowral and look up at the mountain, but go back into whatever aspect of their life they can find a wider field in, and then find consolation and a sense of belonging. For me, actually, in my life, it has been a way I kept myself alive, since survival was what we were talking about last, was to force myself to remember. Because it's an aspect of depression, they say, that one's ego gets very big and one's sense of what is stops at the limits of self. So you are your trauma, that's it, you can't escape it. And I had to kind of force myself in those years to go and run, get outside, like move beyond the confines of the story that we're telling ourselves of how we are. So at a personal level, I think such a practice, as modeled by poems, can keep people in the world, because it models that very thing that we need to keep ourselves doing. So that would be an answer to that question, David.
Yeah. So it's a reminder that we are part of the fabric of the universe, each of us.
Yes, and there's consolation in that, and there's duty in that, I think, and the duty can help as much as the consolation, I think, can't it? Like, there are things out there that need me to be part of them. So I'm going to get outside of my grumpiness or depression and go out there and be with. Being with is another way of saying this too, to be with again what is much larger than ego and biology, etc.
Would it be too much to say that you're saying that we can only live profoundly in the world if we live consciously with the knowledge and understanding of where we fit in the larger scheme of things?
Yeah, I think I'd stand in the company of a lot of much wiser people than myself if I said that, yes, and I think I do believe that. That's a piece of mystic wisdom, I think. On my desk or on one of those shelves over there, I've got a book of Aldous Huxley's, which is an anthology of, it's called The Perennial Wisdom. I nearly forgot the title there. It's a kind of anthology that Aldous Huxley, who is a very Renaissance kind of person, really. He wrote novels. We think A Brave New World. He wrote philosophy. He wrote a book called The Gates of Perception, I think, which was about drug use in a sense, like the use of psychotropics to put yourself to escape the gates of perception, that which we draw too close to ourselves, he said, and the kind of intoxication I alluded to in the other poem, meaning it metaphorically as a practice, or the kind that can be brought on by psychotropics, a thing that they're using in mental health now, of course, too precisely for this reason, to allow us to have a sense of self that's older and wiser and smarter and longer and bigger than just this narrow self story. Is very smart. But if you look at that book of Aldous Huxley's, he just anthologizes works from across well, he's not so strong in the indigenous cultures because no one was back then, but most other cultures like, the Judeo tradition, the Christian tradition, the mystical Western tradition, Sanskrit, Persian, etc., the Arabic traditions, and you find the wiseacres of those cultures all saying something like what you've just said, that wisdom and a well-lived life will entail rediscovering yourself as part of a much larger ecosystem of belonging, if you like. So yes.
Okay. Shall we read some Sijos? You've got a couple of Sijos for us.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I have the Sijo. So Sijo is a Korean form, where they are. Small form, a form I discovered thanks to Dan Disney. You might have been in that batch as well. I forget though. Like Dan at one point, because Dan's teaching in Korea, and he's discovered Korean forms. And then there's a journal that started up back in about 2016 or 17 called Sijo, a journal of song and poetry. It's interesting, isn't it? Because song, again, in that culture is central to the understanding of poetic practice. And so Dan just said, can you write me some Sijo? So like a lot of other people, I suspect I went, yes, and then looked up what a Sijo was and entailed, and then practiced for a little while.
I think I was visiting you around that time. You just discovered the form and you were quite excited by it.
Yeah, I'm excited by it. I still am. I think it's a good form for a failed minimalist like me, because it's short but not excessively short like haiku. And 3 lines, 15 syllable lines, caesura in the middle, and a bunch of other things. But I think they're all self-evident in these two Sijo. I'll read Lyrebird Sijo first because it's, I guess, closer to the form that's meant to include some kind of injunction at the end that's metaphysical, something like what we were just talking about. The second one, which I'll just proceed to, breaks the rule by starting with the proposition first. But Lyrebird Sijo, one Sunday late in autumn, I walk the quarry track in rain. I'm free for the most part, and well past the middle of my years. Listen, each song in the wood sings the same bird. Each life, all lives.
Well, because the poem is so short,
yes,
its title and each line of the poem has to signify and carry a lot of weight.
Yeah.
You make it seem easy, Mark. I'm kind of jealous. But how much wrestling goes on with words and ideas to make a successful Sijo?
Well, you might know in that case, because I think I might have sent you that one that's got the earlier drafts. If not, then there it is. I've actually got my earlier drafts. So that one took me to get to the final line. it took me a couple of hours. Now, not all of those short poems happen anything like that fast, but that one did come. But that's not quite fair because I have notes in my writing journal, which is here on the desk here, of the very first beginnings of that poem. So like, where does the poem start, really?
Mm.
And then at a certain point, I had the image of, so I hear a lyrebird, I have the thought about each life or lives. And then I struggled a lot with how to phrase the opening line. And if you ever look at my drafts, folks, you can see that the struggle. I changed the order of the sentence. One Sunday, do I start with the walk or the rain or the Sunday? I fiddled with all of that over 2-3 hours, I suppose. The thing was, I had a deadline, David, and sometimes deadlines help, don't they? So I wanted to read it at a gig that was coming up. And so that kind of brings, sometimes that's awful, but it's a short poem. So it brought enough sense of concentration. So I worked it through 5-6 drafts, and it took a few hours. But of course, you turn up at the page like that, not like an amateur cricketer at the Sydney Cricket Ground or the Adelaide Cricket Ground. You turn up like Steve Smith. At a certain point, you've practiced a lot. There are a lot of things that your body knows that your mind even sometimes forgets at a certain point. That is one of the benefits of growing old in an art, I think, that you have done things, you have erred quite often. You put in a lot of hours in the nets.
Well, yeah. So this my next question is not going to get me very far, I don't think, because I was going to ask you, if you've got a secret formula for writing a seizure.
The numbers in the form are very important, and I guess I'd just say leaning into the form and not allowing yourself to break the rules. That seems like constraint to most people, but in the end, that's an area of certainty. Like, that's the container for me. 15 syllables a line. I'm looking to break the line with an and or something like it in the middle. No rhyme scheme. On the whole, the lines ought to be discrete, though in a kind of Western interpretation of the seizure, an enjambment's kind of allowable, I think. So I'd say the short answer would be knowing what's certain and respecting it and valuing it, and then playing inside it actually helps a bit. And then using your fingers a lot, because you've got to keep counting to 15.
Yeah.
And of course, that also means more broadly, you've got to say a seizure. You can't just think it.
Yeah. Well, some people say that the constraints of form are a liberation.
Yeah, that's exactly what I say about it. Interestingly, I'd be in some good company there. I think too. That sounds wrong to most people. I know most people see it exactly the other way. They feel like it's a straitjacket, and I know it can be. And of course, to say it's a liberation doesn't mean it's easy. You've got to kind of push through it. But I've got a line that says a poem is a cage. The form is the cage the poem dances down.
Mm.
And that's my sense of its kind of liberation. No cage, no dance, you see. But in the end, the poem, the feeling you don't want is, wow, 15 syllables and a caesura in the middle. What you want is a sense of every word in the poem is resonant with something, and that's the byproduct of the engagement with the form. And then you go, oh wow, would you look at that? 15 lines each, 15 syllables in each line.
I'm struck, and I'm not familiar with the form and haven't read it very much, but I'm struck how in this seizure, the first line is descriptive, the second line is reflective, and the final line is contemplative.
Yeah, right.
In the other one that you're going to read, I would say that the order is a little bit different, but are those the sorts of components that you shuffle when sitting down to write a seizure?
Yeah, and when you put them that way, of course, I would say they're on the table all the time, aren't they? But in a seizure, self-consciously they are, because the seizure scholarship suggests particularly that interiority, what you call contemplation, which I mostly do in the second line, I am free for the most part. That kind of trying not to say self-centered here, but focused on the self, like coming back home to the I and going, where is my life in the context of this and what does it mean? That's supposed to be part of the seizure. There's an encouragement to write in the first person somewhere, to ground the looking and to do a little bit of coming home to one's feeling. And yes, then the third element of beyond the rules about caesuras and syllable count and numbers of lines, there is an injunction to make a spiritual adage or even a political complaint. Many of the seizure writers, ideally metaphorically, but they actually make a I've got another one, for example, written in the midst of, well, the early days actually of COVID, that says how vain we were, forgetting our animal selves. And that's the kind of thing that a CJO is encouraging you to do, like make a bit of a complaint about you and your fellow people, or something of that kind. Yes, there are kind of three elements, but the first one is maybe even the most important. Like the poem absolutely must be grounded somewhere at some time with some things beyond the conceptual and the personal.
This poem ends with the words, each life, all lives. I think you've been drawing threads between, the poets and the rest of us throughout this conversation. It does speak to the gift of reconnection. Do you think one of poetry's most urgent tasks is to draw together threads of connection to facilitate connection or reconnection?
Yeah, that's my fifth gift, I think, isn't it? And my reflection on reconnection takes me in that essay into thinking about metaphor and the potency of metaphoric thinking as a means of imagining a radical connection between things that otherwise we tend to think of as discrete and separate, because that's what metaphor does. I think it's an aspect of ecological and spiritual religious thought, in the sense that religion means religio, which is to connect us up again with. So I think religious ideologies and dogmas and practices speak to a deep human need for how is it that I'm connected again to everything that went before and everything that is and was. So I'd have to say, yes, that I see poetry as taking its place, along with all art forms, but poetry is arguably the anchor art form. It is the very beginning, it's right there at the very beginning of human practice. As soon as we get sophistication of language, poetry is how we speak. And one of the functions, yes, of poetry, is, as I see it, looking at the historical record, is to remind people of their connection to each other, to other forms of life, to places, to ideas, to futures and to pasts. And we get that work done overtly, but actually a fair bit of it one gets done when you just remember some key things about poetry, like get over yourself a little bit, like configure yourself as an instance of all such things. Seamus puts it that way, Seamus Heaney, I love that. The self, he says, is only interesting in literature as an instance. That's so modestly said, but it gets it about right. Yes, you matter a very great deal, and every other life on the planet matters just as much. So find in your own life what might be going on in some others. And so that's about connecting your experience up with others, which is consoling in itself when you begin to imagine it that way, but also pretty good for readers as well, because they find their own experience possibly written out and survived and also transfigured into something maybe beautiful. So there's a deep consolation in that kind of reconnection as it happens for the reader.
You want to read another CJO for us?
Yeah, the other one that I thought of, David, quite rightly, as you said, begins where it should end. And I tried with this one to make it conform, because I respect the forms. I should be ending with a proposition, but this one came to me looking across as described, but it also came with this opening line pretty much packaged up, and I've fiddled with it a few times, but it was always something like 15 syllables. Where it ends, I sometimes call this: we think too much in fences, and we think too little in fields. Across the river in turmeric light, horses graze summer pasture. Where it ends, the divide picks up. On the wind, two hawks.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by compressed, minimalist, as you put it, poetic forms, which I don't write very well either. Well, you write them very well in the CJOs, but the opening line to this poem, we think too much in fences and we think too little in fields, could easily be, to my mind, the opening line to a much longer poem.
Yeah.
And the title to the poem could also signify a much longer poem. So the question I have is, was this originally a longer poem that you paired back to a CJO form, or did you write it intentionally as a CJO?
Yeah, it's funny with poems and their length, isn't it? I think when I wrote this poem, I was thinking in Suzhou. That makes sense. I had been writing smaller forms, especially the Suzhou, not heaps of them, but I had been in that space, and I find that form has agency over imagination, if you like, or over making, not over it, but it has agency in the making of the work. It's almost as though sometimes one's apprehension is sculpted by the form that you're inhabiting, in a sense. I can't think, David, to get to your question, of a moment where that particular poem was going to be anything else than a Suzhou. So, and the thing that's weird about that poem is that I tried and tried, if I look at my drafts here, to get the opening line to be the final line, because I am in breach of the form here. And I have got other drafts, but they just don't sort of work poetically. But that was all of the fiddling with that poem, was to try and was between the first line and the third line. But you're right that it opens out into very big territory, possibly, particularly when I title it Where It Ends. But the work of the small poem, I remember I was with Carol Moldau and Arthur Z in China, and Carol's been writing a lot. In fact, most of Carol's work, their husband and wife, those two, most of Carol's work has been small lyric poems, and we had a conversation about the power of the small poem. And even as a writer of long poems, like you, David, on the whole, and longer in my case mostly, I do think I love the small poems the best. Greg Day once described me as a failed minimalist, which is a really lovely disparagement.
I'd hate to see if you're a successful one. My God.
But yes, it's like most of my poems. I suppose one had wished that they might be tucked in a bit more. But I think what that means is when I come to a small poem, very often there's a lot implicit, and the implication is the power of the poem.
Well, that is exactly going to be my next question, actually, because when you say you sort of fiddled with the lines and there's so many sort of drafts and so on and so forth, all that's behind what ends up on the page, doesn't it?
That's it. Yeah, that is right. I think what we read in a poem that seems to be just so perfectly adequate is what gets there because of everything else you've chiseled off. So this one never had much more length, but I did work and rework the lines. Like I didn't have turmeric in there at one point. I had astringent or something else. And, so there's a whole lot of, killing darlings and standing off. And sometimes the effect of that is to end up with something that implies the absences, implies all the other things that came to mind in the choices that you leave on the page.
So you take away the length, but you actually add depth.
Yeah, that's a way of putting it. I think layeredness, certainly implication in what's left. It's one of the uses of form, I must say, because form is always an insistence. It's always a constraint on trade, isn't it? And you're having to force yourself into a kind of, by virtue of the artifice of the constraint, you're having to make decisions about language that you wouldn't otherwise have to make. The free verse poet doesn't have to make so many decisions. The prose writer doesn't either, as a writer in form has to make. And if part of your project is always to be as radically clear as you can and not weird in the language using, if part of your purpose is to end up with something, in other words, that feels as though it had no form in the first place, then you spend a lot of time in the nets. You put a lot of time in.
And you want to make it seem unforced.
Unforced, yeah. Like somebody, more than one person has said this, I guess, but the purpose of all method is to appear to have no method.
Yes.
And, that's what many of the great poetic forms ones in the various languages have understood quite well, I think. I remember, schoolboy Latin used to be said that Virgil was about the only Roman poet who mastered meter as opposed to having been mastered by meter. It's a fairly harsh criticism of his colleagues, but you can sort of sense it in Virgil if you get hold of it, just how effortless it seems. And of course, there is a lot of effort, but you can't feel it. You just, you get the accomplishment.
Well, you've mentioned a little bit about, all the work behind what you end up with here. How many iterations of a poem like this would you typically write before you get the poem that you want?
My standard variation here is between sometimes as few as 2 or 3, and mostly in the order of 10, and sometimes 15 to 20. Other poets, we just put this book together actually for at the press, where this is specifically what we look at. We take a first draft and a finished draft, and some of my colleagues, like Jodie, for example, and Anthony, talk about sometimes almost countless numbers of drafts. It depends what you count as a draft, I think, David, doesn't it? Like, as one of the Irish poets said, you use smaller and smaller screwdrivers as you go on mending. But sometimes the changes are quite radical. But it seems to me, by comparison, I don't do quite so many drafts. I think that's because I sweat the first one really hard. I don't tend to start very loose. I tend to start with something that's approximating more finished work. That's been my habit of the last few years. Not altogether a good thing, because sometimes that puts me off. Like, I think there's a freedom in just beginning with a scroll on a page and starting, but something in my mind, something Methodist probably, wants to be productive. And so, like I go, if I haven't got enough to start, so I just don't start. But when I do start something, I tend to insist upon very quickly it's arriving at something like an achievable poem, or I don't give up. Like, I don't have a lot of wasted work there. I guess it's just the way it works for me. Lots of drafts, mostly on average 10, I'd say.
Good, interesting to know. Now you've got another Cijo for us.
I have another Cijo. This one's I suppose it's a little more recent. You can see on this one I've actually left my 5 iterations. So this one happened, those 5 drafts happened in an afternoon, I think. And I'm just fiddling.
Same page. That's interesting.
All on the same page, yeah. Because it's such a small form, I sometimes do that with the small ones. It's actually, I suppose, the working process, because I look at it and then I copy the first one down normally and then start changing what I'm changing. This one starts, in soft rain, I walk the eucalypt woods one Sunday in fall, and then I walk the quarry trail in soft rain one Sunday late in fall. And then I go one Sunday in late autumn, I walk the quarry path in rain. So I'm fiddling with the way I start mostly. And that's all about cadence and, I don't know, something that feels right. I'll read you the final form though. One Sunday late in autumn, I walk the quarry track in rain. I'm free for the most part, and well past the middle of my years. Listen, each song in the wood sings the same bird. Each life, all lives.
I find myself almost repeating myself here because we're covering the same territory, but it's worth going over because the poem is so short. Its title, which you didn't read, which is the Lyrebird Cijo. And each line of the poem has to signify and has to carry the weight of the poem. You make it seem easy. And the question was how much wrestling goes on with words and ideas to make a successful Cijo.
So I think I can recall, David, having quite a bit of time went by between the episode where I walked up there. The quarry is up on what's called the Jib here, Mount Gibraltar or Mittagong. And they used to quarry that trachyte up there. In fact, the QVB is built out of this mountain, and Customs House in Sydney and everything. I find it very moving, and it's a space that nature is reclaiming. But a month or more had gone by between taking the walk, jotting the notes down, I think on my phone, which is sometimes how I work it, and then I scribbled on paper. And I think with that one, I thought for quite a long time I might make a different kind of small poem called the tanka. You know the tanka, the Japanese form, and it's not like a tanka's got what 31 syllables, I think, and the seijo's 45, so they're sort of in the same range of length in my mind. And I think I might have even scrawled by hand a tanka version of that, but there was a little bit more to be said than I could put in the tanka. So after some time went by, I thought, no, it's a poem that's insisting on being written, and the seijo seems to form. Let me have a go. And when I got something like what became the various iterations of the opening line falling into alignment with 15 syllables with a caesura in the middle, I thought, yeah, this one wants to be a seijo, and I worked it out. So I guess I began with a moment and some weather and a place, a thought about a kind of personal thought, as I think you reflected before, about one's life, more or less free in the middle of my years, that kind of personal reflection on the state of one's being. And then the larger one, which draws on the metaphor of the lyrebird, which I'd heard up there, of course. And it gives you a chance to speak to the idea of the radical interconnectedness of things, because, of course, the lyrebird's song is the songs of all the other things in the forest. And so then I think I worked for quite some time to get the thought about, see, in another version, I've got each life spends all life, each time takes all time. So I'm playing with each and all through a number of different versions. And then I end up with sings the same bird. Each song sings the same bird, which pleased me because it flips the expected expression of that thought. And then each life or lives is an economical way to get a comment made about the bird, but also about oneself and one's belonging in the larger scheme of things. That's not a new thought for me. I've carried it through my poetry and my essay writing and thinking and philosophy, I suppose, for years and years, going way back to when I did my doctoral work on eco-criticism and trying to deepen into thoughts about a literature that might do more justice to the interconnectedness of things. It's the thought I've carried most of my life, I think. But in that moment of hearing the lyrebird and realizing that it was a lyrebird and not, in fact, the 3 or 4 different birds which it was purporting to be, I thought, I've got to get this written. This one's a gift.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by, your sort of suggestion that the poem insisted that it was going to be a particular form. Does that happen a lot with you? Like the poem, you're trying to write something and then it says, no, I don't want to be this. I want to be something else.
Yeah, yes, it's sometimes maddening, though. It seems to me like if poetry is a goddess, she's a mean goddess. She's like she's like an anti-muse is the kind of thing I've got, where she tricks you all the time, or they trick you all the time into thinking that you need to write one kind of thing and then going, ha ha, I tricked you there. That's how it often feels. But sometimes it's a much more natural mode. And there are, as I was saying before, I think times when, for example, when I was writing the 9 carols in the 9x9 that we were talking about before, I think, I find myself just thinking in those modes, and material just seems to arrive, packaged in something like that form. But I suppose what actually happens is that at a certain point among the forms, or the relatively formless forms that one might choose, sometimes I agonize. I don't like it about my process because it's uncomfortable, but I sometimes agonize and don't start, or because I can't sort of commit. Love the one you're with, as they say. I need to find the one and just go with that and see if it'll work. And then I finally just go, oh, just throw yourself into that one and see if it works. And there are poems I've written that have worked through a number of different forms. because I'll look at the one that I began with and think, I don't think, as Robert Frost once, I think it was Frost said this, the form should serve the content and the content the form. And so you're looking for that kind of correspondence, I suppose. And that's a felt sense. Sometimes I think, as you know, I teach a lot of form in the masterclass and other places, and I do love it. But I often concede that the more forms you know, the more agonies you're going to have of choice, because it's rare, to get back really to the heart of your question, it's rare that the poem arrives with just one certain form
So
attached to it.
you don't set out to write a Sejo.
I sometimes do, but I was thinking about that because Jodie Beveridge says something about that in the book. She says, I'm not the kind of poet who would ever sit down to write a villanelle, she says. And I thought to myself, am I the poet? I rarely respond to prompts in that way, so I suppose it doesn't really arise for me. It's more like what you're getting at, where there's the force of the idea and the images and the thought, all the stuff that wants a poem written, and then there's a consideration that I have about the form that will be apt for that kind of content, and then there's the experiment to see whether that intuition was right or not. And about a third of the time it's right, and the rest of the time you then fumble around for the other one and find it. I do have some poems where, like, I finished the poem as a prose poem and then radically altered it 3 or 4 different times into different forms. And occasionally I just go, I can't decide. But generally making the change to apply the form to relatively finished work means that you are altering the languaging, because it's a rare change that won't entail change to the languaging and the form. So then you are in fact committing to the new form at that stage, and you can't go back. So there is a kind of ugly sort of dance that goes on there, David, sometimes in the reconciliation between the content and the form. But occasionally with a couple of these that I've read today, it's been straightforward, and that's a delight. It feels like a gift.
So let's just say you arrive at a point where you realize this is going to be a Sejo, right?
Yeah.
Do you then have a formula for writing a Sejo?
Well, yeah, and they're not really my formulae, like I'm just going, what is a Sejo? What is a 9x9x9? What is a sonnet? And of course that involves my affections and choices. But Sejo is a form that allows some variation, quite a bit actually, but it's got some fairly fixed rules. So 3 lines is a given. Syllable count in the order of 15 is a given, and some ideas about content where there's a thought and there's some observation about interiority and a place and a time and a weather and a mood. And formally, in terms of the technique and the mathematics, I'm looking for 15 syllables per line, no rhyme scheme, each line more or less independent of the other, but with some continuity, and a caesura, a break in the syntax halfway through the line. Those are the given rules, and I take them and try to do justice to them, I suppose, is how that works.
Well, I was struck by how in this Sejo, on my reading of it, the first line is descriptive, the second line is reflective, and the final line is contemplative.
Yeah.
And in the other Sejo you read, I would say the second line was descriptive, the first line was perhaps reflective, and the third again was contemplative. So I'm just wondering whether those are the sorts of components that you shuffle when sitting down to write a Sejo.
Yeah, I think one of the ideas that I understand about the Sejo is that the work of the philosophizing or the metaphysics, however we're going to categorize that, is properly done in the last line. So Leibert's conforms, and where it ends does not conform. And I tried to make where it ends conform, and in a sense failed, and then just thought, well, this is an unconforming Sejo. but I wouldn't be happy just to, if someone said to me later, "Oh, Mark, you do realize that you've started with your metaphysics." That's a serious matter of practice for me, that we should be respectful of the forms before we start chucking the rules out the window or just going, "Oh, that'll do." That's the way that I kind of work it. And your observation about the three elements of the Sijia is accurate. In my understanding, but in my understanding, there are the two lines, and then there's the one line. So it's in the final line that you're supposed to take the kind of leap from the physical to the metaphysical, if you like. And in the first two lines, doesn't matter quite in what order, you need to locate it in time and place, and in mood, which brings in the personal. So that's the work of the first two lines, which you might distribute differently across those lines as you carry on.
There's a lot more to it than first meets the eye, isn't there?
There is a lot more to it than first meets the eye. And again, I'm glad that that's the case for you, that it didn't meet the eye, because that's the purpose of the form, really, is to transcend it, not to slavishly obey it.
Yeah. This poem ends with the words, "Each life, all lives," which speaks to the gift of reconnection, which is what you're talking about. Do you think one of poetry's most urgent tasks is to draw together threads of connection to facilitate connection or reconnection?
Yeah, I guess I do. That's the fifth gift, as I describe it in the essay, and that doesn't mean it's the fifth most important. It in a way, that list of gifts builds. It builds toward the one that's coming next, and reconnection is the second last. I guess I think it's important politically, ecologically, spiritually. I might put it that way. The work of reconnection. Yes, I do think that profoundly. And it seems to me that poetry has one way to understand, I guess some people might say lyric poetry, but to speak of lyric poetry is pretty much to speak of poetry in its longer term across cultures, where we make various subdivisions of poetry in contemporary times. But most of poetry has been a lyric enterprise, and a fair bit of that enterprise, it seems to me, David, has been to allow humans to feel accompanied, reading a poem, to feel accompanied in their solitude. So I sometimes put that. That's been the work of religions, and not all philosophy, but let's just say religions. Religion's a key word under this heading for me, too, in the proper old sense of the word, because I forget who it was who first said this to me, but it struck me. It might have been Thomas More or somebody, but religion from the Latin is re and ligio, and it really almost literally means to reconnect. Reconnection is the work that religion attempts to perform for us. And you could read that many different ways. One sense I've always had is that I think at the heart of being human is to feel as though there's an order of things, and we've lost our connection with it. We're feeling alienated in some sense, the alienation of the human condition, the kind of toxic solitude, if you like, that all of us get to feel all of the time, or some of the time. Psychologists talk about this expression too, and I think the experience of mental illness, if it's of the depressive kind, especially, and many people get to experience that, some people profoundly. I've been through my periods of suffering from that, and at the heart of that experience for me certainly was the sense of a profound and irredeemable loneliness, a disconnection from everything that once I'd loved and felt made meaning of my existence. And religion has attempted to reconnect people through various mechanisms of community work and fellowship and liturgy and various litanies and so on. But older than religion really is poetry. Poetry, if you like, is the original religious work which attempts to say, you know, here in your solitude, or here in my solitude, sometimes my delight, indeed, I am not alone in this. This is one instance of all being happening right now. And in that thought, for me, has always been a profound comfort. And so that's one thing that poem's trying to say, I suppose, at the end. It strikes me sometimes at the moment, we live in shrill times, we live in argumentative times where people put others into categories and blame them for it. And left and right are all responsible for the same kind of thing. And what's going missing in the discourses of the moment, and I think for me, it underlies the epidemics of loneliness and mental illness that we have, is the inadequacies of secular discourses, particularly those that are inflected by identifications and, you know, categories, the absence in those discourses of a strong sense of what it is that connects, to get back to your point, you know, and you know, it's fine to kind of protest one's uniqueness in the world, but deep down, each of us is an instance of exactly the same thing. We are an instance of being, and in that there's profound fellowship in that, if you want to find it. And how does poetry address that? Well, that's another whole big thing. It often doesn't address it best when it does it directly. You see, I'm getting close to making an assertion in that poem, and I don't mind doing that in poetry myself, and I quite like it when good poets do it, get something said memorably, but actually probably arguably it's more powerful efficacy poetry in knitting us back up together again is performed through its lyricism, I think, through the rhythm structures and what it is that happens when you use just enough syllables to get something said. This kind of a reconciliation that occurs like a hum, and one is back within the frequencies of all being, if you like. That sounds grand, but I think that's kind of the way it works. And for me, that's one of the reasons why rhythm and lyricism of utterance are so important, because without them, I think the spiritual work, the reconnective tissue, if you like, of poetry can't really be done. You can argue all you like, you can describe an intellect all you like, but you're not going to get people close to home without the musicality.
I mean, poetry in the writing of it is a solitary activity, but in its essence, it's a reaching out, and that's
funny,
where.
though.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's funny that, David, isn't it? Like there's paradox at the heart of that, of course, but you know, it can't be well performed. Well, I'm surprised by how well some people manage to write their poetry in company. I can rarely ever sit in a crowded room and get the damn thing worth reading done.
Right.
Yeah. So it's funny. It does. I think it demands of us a kind of a deep solitude. You know, a quietness, a centering of, you know, oneself on the activity for some time. But the purpose of all of that is to arrive at something, if you like, deep enough within one's unique experience to be not merely personal, but to be human. I think that's and that's where we cross that bridge, I think, sometimes.
All right, we've got one more poem on one more gift.
The poem is Splitting Wood, and the gift is justice, and I think the connection will be apparent, and I'll speak some more about justice in a moment. Splitting Wood, this poem is now ridiculously old. There was a young girl connected with this poem in my mind who's just finished her HSC. She was about 8 at the time, and she took a shot. I remembered later the events of this poem, because she got my phone and took a couple of shots at me splitting the wood. Splitting Wood, it starts with some words which are important to the poem, actually, by Seamus Heaney from his poem, A Herbal. Enemies, part of a world nobody seemed able to explain, but that had to be put up with. And here's where my poem begins. Splitting wood, I think of my enemy. It seems to me a useful kind of striking back, feeding, as it does, fire with a better kind of fire. It's an upcycling of lost limbs, a judo of redemptive violence, and it leaves no one very much the worse for wear. I raise the splitter high and swing it low, baffled by the poverty of my enemy's soul, so very like my own. Sorry to have been the cause of such banality of thought and word, but very, very certain of my aim, not at the log, but through it. And when this afternoon, thinking of the head in particular, of the one who's chosen me as his work and libel as his play, when this afternoon I brought my splitter down and brought it down hard on what I'd thought would be the toughest round of all, it split like a pumpkin and spilled a million termite larvae, pale unleavened angels, across the rainy and all-hallowed end of day.
Mark, remind me to stay on your good side.
But everyone's done that, haven't they? Like splitting wood, and splitting wood is really good for that kind of harmless expression of dark emotion, it turns out. Anyway, I you know, no apologies possible. I felt what I felt. It helped, and of course, the great thing, it's almost like life, nature sometimes want to teach you the lesson, which was number one, the realization halfway through my enactment of my redemptive violence, as I put it in the poem, was the realization that what I'm hating is the poverty of my own
Yes.
soul, and then the demonstration of that by, I pick up this last round of wood. I think it's going to be hard, so I really go for it hard, and it's hollow. There's nothing in it because it's filled with larvae, and so they explode across the afternoon, which is I can figure them as unleavened angels, unrisen yet, which is true scientifically, I suppose, but also I'm making a religious reference there. So I get found out.
But it struck me, the gift of justice. What kind of justice are you referring to here?
Well, in the gift, it's such a powerful word, justice, and it's got lots of layers to it. I often quote, I think I do in that part of the essay, Seamus Heaney from his Nobel Prize speech, where he says, and I'll paraphrase him here, but he says, poetry speaks, I think he says, responds maybe uniquely to two paradoxical or contradictory. So it uniquely speaks to two contradictory needs of the human spirit in times of, I think he says, trauma or crisis, meaning either personal, I think, or political. So, wow. And in that sense, it does justice, you see. What are the two unique and contradictory needs? One is the need for what he calls a redemptive, I think he uses redemptive, I'm channeling him there, redemptive truth-telling. That's what he says in the speech, like a kind of a naming of the arseholes, like a speaking in no uncertain terms, that kind of thing. But that's only half of it, you see, and too much for mine. Too much contemporary poetry is doing that one, but not the second one. It's just kind of wagging a finger, and that comes off as piety in the end, and wouldn't, in Seamus's terms, speak to the deeper need, which is for not just that, but some kind of levity, if you like, some kind of kindness and tenderness. at the same time, he says, think about that proposition. I think it's probably right. You know, traumatized, we need justice done, but we also want to be cuddled. We want to be held in our silliness, in our pain. And he says poetry can sometimes uniquely speak to both those needs at once. So something like that sort of sense of justice, David, is what I've got in mind under that heading in the gifts.
Mm. And there are parts of ourselves that we don't sometimes acknowledge even to ourselves. I think part of poetry is exploring that and sort of digging around in that.
Yeah.
Or that we acknowledge to ourselves, but often prefer to remain hidden from view.
Yeah.
Thinking here of things like bitterness, vengeance, retribution, the propensity for violence, and all of these things are on show in this poem.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether poetry here is a mechanism for purging, for writing out and then getting rid of these kinds of inclinations.
Splitting wood is, I can tell you that. Splitting wood definitely is. You know, I suppose what I'm thinking here is that it seems to me that the purging that matters isn't mine, of course. It's not the poet's. Who cares about the poet? The purging that chiefly matters is is the hope that this might make a reader go, oh yeah, there's that old thing. So some kind of recognition, or that, I mean, I guess this connects with the first gift of forgiveness as well, some kind of the poem can sometimes lay out something on the page that's intended to be not just mine, nor to be yours, because it's presumptuous of me to think that I know anything much about the readers. But you can hope to have discovered something human, I suppose, as I was just saying. And to be human is to be flawed and sometimes beautifully flawed. And the poem might find a way to recognizing in something that happens in one's own experience, something that might be, as the young ones say, relatable in that. And so I would really hope for a kind of purging, I suppose, of readers. I mean, I do think, thinking historically about the larger purposes of poetry, that's certainly been one of the purposes of the poem. As Gregory Orr, I think I was talking about him before, says in his book Poetry as Survival, poetry was evolved in order to keep us alive, to keep us sane. And so he would say yes in answer to this question. It's the hope that there's enough poetry that gets written that allows people to recognize the silliness of their own natures, the flawedness of their own natures, and the beauty inside that, and also just to feel a little bit of encouragement to do a tiny bit better.
Work in progress. It's always a work.
Yeah, exactly.
How does the understanding reach towards the end of the poem that the wood was rotten at its core, which acts as a metaphor for the rot perceived at the core of the enemy and of ourselves as well, assist the poem's narrator in coming to terms with the situation?
You know what happened in actuality was I burst out laughing. So it's like, and that speaks to one of the elements of doing justice in art, I think, and it's always to me got something to do with a play between gravity and levity, and that connects, I think, in my mind, to what Seamus is saying there before in that thing I quoted. Paraphrase to you. There's and levity is profoundly important, and like I did break out laughing, so that's a moment of recognition of something light. But levity is about spirit, I think, as well. It is about lightness of being and recognizing one's flawedness and just going, "What the hell," like that kind of thing. So I think what happened in life and in the poem, I think the metaphor does this work too, is to find us out in our excesses of seriousness, in our certainties about the injustice that's been done, some recognition that, hey, you know what, someone else might be feeling exactly like this at the same time. I'm not the only person ever to have received this kind of barb. That kind of thing is the work that the event and the image in the poem, I think, achieves to invite us back to our flawed and beautiful ordinary humanity. That's
So it's a kind of a wake-up call, like note to self, hello.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the thing in the poem that was quite sort of powerful is I had no, well, in life, I didn't intend that. I could, I really was found out by the nature of things because I thought it was going to be genuinely the hardest round, and so I hit it. I hit it harder than ever. So there was nothing intentional about the lesson that I was served, and that makes it more powerful and I think more beautiful and funny in a way, because we there is always a risk that we get very bound up in our egos and intentions and certainties, and one will be found out, I guess, and sometimes to good effect.
I mean, I love the way how after all of this sort of violence and retribution and so on, the end of the poem invokes the holiness of the rainy and all-hallowed end of the day, which is a very reverential line to finish off with. How did you mean that line to sit with the feelings and moods and actions that preceded it in the poem?
Well, if you go back to the articulations in the poem, David, you will see that they're nearly always double. So when there's violence, it's redemptive, and it's a more useful kind of fire, that kind of thing. So the poem is always conscious that there are two things going on, and there is some holiness inside the anger or the hope of it. So I think what I was mostly trying to capture though was delightedness, just the I don't really believe in angels. I don't know about you, but I can't really go there, but I love the idea that I love the metaphor, I guess, of the angel as it runs through things, that each moment might in fact be inhabited by wisdom and mischief, I think, in a way, greater than we're capable of knowing ourselves. And it tends to show up. It tends to show up for me in natural occurrences. I think it was Bob Adamson who once said, why do I write so many birds? Birds are the closest things we have to angels these days.
Mm.
If he did say it, I thank him. If he didn't, I thank whoever said it, because it's so lovely in a way in that poem that, the larvae inhabiting the semi-rotten log are just natural, but they serve in life, and as they're turned out in the poem, to allow somebody to recognize how things are never as simple as they seem, and that there's always a lesson to be learned, and that one was being pompous, possibly for a moment, but justifiably too. Like I want to say, it's right to feel rage sometimes, but it's probably not good to stop there if you can help it, because quite likely you yourself have been guilty of the same kind of injustice in somebody else's eyes. So recognition of the things. So I guess for me, the idea of the angels carries those idea of a deeper, higher wisdom that we sometimes can get access to, and poetry can help us get there sometimes.
And this poetry has, and it's been a delight to talk with you about the 6 gifts and your poems. Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing those poems and exploring those ideas and thoughts and insights on this very interesting theme. Details of Mark's books and where to get them will be posted, or some of them at least, will be posted with this podcast, so please look out for them. That's our last podcast for 2024. We'll be back in 2025 with another great lineup of Australian poets, kicking off in February with John Fulcher. See you then.